Welcome back, legends. You're at Game of Theories. Another incredible story awaits. What if a neglected bastard Jon hatched a dragon in the crypts? Subscribe and hit the bell. Let's dive right in. Chapter 1. The stone that breathed the crypts smelled like cold and old things, which was the only reason Jon liked them. Above him, through 2 floors of stone and timber and the thick Winterfell walls, he could hear the great hall filling up with noise. Robb's name day, 11 years old and the heir to the north, and Maester Luwin had arranged for a full feast. Musicians from White Harbor, a juggler who apparently kept a trained raven that could catch rings on command, and enough roasted boar to feed the garrison twice over. Jon had watched the preparations from the yard that morning, had seen the tables being carried in and the good candles lit, the ones that smelled like beeswax instead of tallow. He had not been invited. That was not entirely true, and he knew it. No one had told him specifically that he was unwelcome, but no one had told him when the feast would start. No one had come to find him when it did. His place setting, if there had been one, would have been at the very end of the lower table, far from Lord Stark and Lady Stark and all 5 of their legitimate children. And someone would have said something cutting before the first course was cleared. Lady Catelyn had a gift for it, and so did some of the household knights who learned from her example, and the evening would have ended with Jon leaving early and pretending he had not wanted to be there in the first place. So he had come here instead. Before anyone could not invite him, before Robb could look at him with that expression he had sometimes, the one that was equal parts guilt and helplessness and relief, that the guilt hadn't hardened into action yet. Jon was 10 years old, and he had already learned that preemptive retreating felt better than being pushed. He carried a candle stub in one hand and nothing else. The crypts were deep, and the dark was absolute beyond his small circle of light. The Stark kings stared down from their stone thrones, one after another, back into a history so old it stopped being history and became something closer to myth. Jon knew all their names. He'd learned them from old Nan, who told stories the way other people breathed, and from the books in Maester Luwin's library that nobody else bothered to read. Torrhen Stark, who knelt. Theon Stark, the hungry wolf. Edwin the Spring King. Brandon the Burner. On and on, faces that all shared the same long jaw and watchful eyes, chiseled by masons who had never met them but understood something true about the Stark blood anyway. Jon liked the crypts because the dead Starks didn't look at him like he was a problem. He walked further than he usually did, past the section his father visited sometimes, past the fresh-cut stone of the spaces being prepared for the generation not yet dead, down into the part of the crypts where the passages narrowed and the ceiling dropped and the air changed quality, became denser, older, full of a cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with time. The candle's flame bent sideways for no reason. Jon stopped. There was no wind down here. The crypt was sealed, the air still. He looked at the candle and the flame straightened and then bent again, toward the left-hand wall like it was being called. He almost turned back. He was 10 years old and alone and very deep underground, and the smart thing was absolutely to turn back. He turned left instead. The passage that opened up was low enough that he had to duck his head, and it ended after 20 feet in a chamber that was barely large enough to turn around in. No throne here, no effigy, no carved name. Just stone walls, a stone floor, and a stone shelf built into the back wall that might once have been an altar or a bier or simply a place to put things and then forget about them. On the shelf, sitting in a nest of what looked like black sand and old ash, was a stone. Jon held the candle toward it. The stone was roughly oval, about the size of a large man's fist, and it was not gray like the crypt walls. It was a deep, layered gray that shifted when the light hit it, sometimes almost black, sometimes showing veins of dull red and silver that seemed to move independent of the flame. It was warm. He could tell from 3 feet away. The air immediately around it had that same dry warmth you got near a hearth, radiating soft and steady. He should not have touched it. He knew, even at 10, in the way children know things that adults refuse to know, that he should not have touched it. He touched it. The warmth moved through his palm like a word in a language he hadn't known he spoke. His candle went out. He stood in total darkness with the stone in his hands and felt, for the first time in his life, that something in the world was glad he existed. He took it home. He kept it under his mattress for 2 days before it occurred to him that this was a genuinely terrible hiding place, and spent the better part of an afternoon engineering a proper one. A loose stone in the corner of his small room, the one that had always wobbled slightly when he stepped on it, which he pried up to find a cavity about a foot deep filled with old dirt and one iron nail. He emptied it out, lined it with the spare undershirt he'd outgrown, and nested the stone inside. He did not know what it was. He had theories. Theory 1 was that it was nothing, just a warm rock, and the warmth came from some natural process in the deep stone, and he was a fool who had carried a rock up from the crypts like a crow, bringing something shiny back to its nest. He entertained this theory for about 6 hours before discarding it. Theory 2 was that it was one of the things he'd read about, and he had read considerably more than most people expected, because being invisible in a household meant you could raid the Meister's library without anyone tracking what you took, a dragon egg. Not a real one, not one from a living dragon, but the old books mentioned eggs sometimes, ancient ones found in tombs and ruins and deep places, turned to stone by the long cold centuries. Most of them were empty. Most of them would never hatch. One book, written by a Citadel scholar whose name Jon had never been able to pronounce, said that the heat of a living dragon could wake even a stone-cold egg. But there were no living dragons. Theory 3, which he was least comfortable with but which kept surfacing whenever he held the stone, was that it wanted him specifically. That it had been waiting, that the warmth he'd felt hadn't been passive radiation from some geological process but recognition, the way a dog's tail moved before you even opened the door, because it heard your footsteps and knew them. He held the stone every night after that. He stopped sleeping much. Not because of fear, the stone's warmth was the opposite of frightening, but because lying awake holding it in the dark felt more real than anything else in his life. More real than the yard, where he sparred with Robb, and Robb was always slightly better because Robb's arms were longer, not because he was more skilled. But Jon could never admit to knowing that without it sounding like an excuse. More real than the great hall, where he ate quickly and kept his eyes on his plate. More real than Lady Stark's voice, which he had learned to hear and simultaneously not hear, the way you learn to ignore certain kinds of cold after enough exposure. On the 9th night, the stone cracked. Jon was sitting on his bed, the stone cradled in both hands, and he felt it before he heard it. A minute shift in the warmth, a pulse, rhythmic and strong like a heartbeat but lower, more fundamental. The way a drum is more fundamental than a voice. Then a sound, a crack so thin and precise it might have been a knuckle popping, and a line appeared in the stone, gray on gray, running from one end to the other in a slow, deliberate arc. Jon held very still. He held still for a long time after that. He did not know how long. The crack widened, and he could see the faintest thread of orange-red light along its edge, and the heat intensified until he should have been burned and was not. And then the top of the egg split away from the bottom in 2 clean halves, and something fell into Jon's hands and looked up at him. It was the size of a large cat, slate-gray with scales so fine they looked almost like skin, darkening to near black along its spine and wings and lightening to silver at its underside. Its eyes were open and they were pale, almost white, with pupils like vertical slits of absolute dark, and it was looking at Jon with an attention that no animal had ever given him, an attention that felt personal and specific and ancient. It made no sound. Jon's throat was tight. He thought he might cry, which was absurd. He thought about Robb's name-day feast. He thought about the long, empty halls and the dead kings and his candle going out. And then he thought about none of those things, because the dragon headbutted his chin with a motion that was somehow both regal and completely undignified, and Jon laughed. The sound startled him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that, not politely, not carefully, but fully, the kind of laugh that comes up from somewhere below thought. The dragon made a sound then, not a roar. A low, resonant sound, like a coal settling in a grate, a sound that seemed to come from inside Jon's chest rather than from outside his ears. Greysmoke, Jon said. He hadn't planned it. The name arrived the same way the warmth had, like something he'd always known. The dragon looked at him, and Jon felt with absolute conviction that the name was correct. The first week was chaos contained entirely within Jon's room, which was the one advantage of having a room that nobody visited. Greysmoke ate everything. That was the first thing Jon learned. He started with the egg shells, cracking them apart with an efficiency that was startling in something so newly born, and ate every fragment. Then he looked at Jon, and Jon, operating on some combination of instinct and desperation, went to the kitchens in the middle of the night and stole a ham shank, 2 rounds of hard cheese, and half a bucket of chicken bones that had been destined for the stock pot. Greysmoke ate all of it, including the bones, with a patient, thorough concentration that reminded Jon of the way Lord Stark ate when he was thinking about something else, all business, no waste. By the end of the week, Greysmoke had outgrown the room's floor space. By the end of the second week, Jon had to move him to the small attached storage space that connected to his room through a low door, which meant Jon now slept with the door open, and the slightly sulfuric smell of a young dragon drifting through his sleep, which he found he didn't mind at all. He brought bones from the crypts. He found in one of the oldest passages a chamber with a collapsed wall that had spilled an ancient burial site into the corridor, bones, dozens of them, long-dried and brittle. He didn't know whose they were. He said a brief and sincere apology to the heir and carried them out in a sack. Greysmoke ate them with an expression that Jon could only describe as reverent. "You're eating the old kings," Jon told him. Greysmoke looked at him with those pale eyes, and the coal-settling sound came again. "Don't look at me like that. I told them I was sorry." The dragon set his chin on Jon's knee and closed his eyes, and Jon put his hand on Greysmoke's head, between the emerging ridges that would eventually be horns, and felt the warmth and the heartbeat and the absolute, uncomplicated acceptance of the bond between them. He thought, "I would burn the world for this." He thought, "I think he already knows that." Ghost complicated everything. The direwolf pup had been his since the day in the wolf's wood, the run of the litter found apart from the others, white and red-eyed and quiet in a way the other pups weren't. Jon and Ghost had their own language, mostly silence, and the wolf had never shown fear of anything, not the yard dogs, not horses, not Hodor, who was the most alarming thing in the castle when encountered around a corner at speed. Ghost met Greysmoke at the end of the second week. When Jon returned to his room to find the wolf had bypassed the door latch, Ghost had learned doors months ago, and Jon kept forgetting, and was sitting in front of the storage room entrance, staring at the door with the absolute focus of a creature that has found something interesting and is planning its next move. Jon got between him and the door. "Ghost!" Ghost looked at him. Jon had never been entirely certain how much the direwolf understood versus how much he simply chose to comply with. But the wolf's expression was unambiguous. It communicated, in the way all large carnivores communicated, that the door was not an obstacle. "He's mine," Jon said, which felt like a strange thing to say and also felt entirely true. Ghost tilted his head. Then he made a sound that was not quite a whine and not quite a growl, somewhere between them, and sat back on his haunches. Jon opened the storage room door. What happened next was not what he expected, which was some form of the classic predator meets prey chaos. What happened was that Greysmoke, who had grown to roughly the size of a large dog in 2 weeks and showed no signs of stopping, raised his head, looked at Ghost with those pale eyes, and made the coal-settling sound. Ghost looked back. Then the wolf walked into the room, curled up against the dragon's side, and went to sleep. Greysmoke put his head back down on top of Ghost's flank. Jon stood in the doorway for a moment. "Right," he said. "Fine, that's fine." He was smiling again. It kept happening. He wasn't sure what to do about it. It was Arya who found them first. He should have expected it. Arya was 7 years old and treated Winterfell as a territory to be mapped and dominated, and any part of it she hadn't personally inspected made her anxious. She had discovered Jon's room's external wall had a fingertip-friendly crack in the stone that could be used to climb to the window, and she had apparently been doing exactly this for months as a personal physical challenge, which Jon only learned when he heard her voice from the window saying, "Jon is Ghost in here. I saw him go." And then silence that was very different from ordinary silence, the silence of a child seeing something that reorganized her understanding of the world. He turned around. Arya was hanging halfway through the window, elbows on the sill, and she was staring at Greysmoke, who had grown another third in the past week and was currently the size of a small pony, and looking at Arya with the polite interest of something that has never encountered a Stark girl delivered through a window and is deciding what to make of it. "Jon," Arya said. Her voice was very careful. "That is a dragon." "Yes." "That's your dragon." "Yes." She climbed the rest of the way through the window. She landed in a crouch on the floor, straightened up, and walked directly toward Greysmoke without any apparent hesitation, which told Jon several things about his sister that he'd already suspected. Greysmoke watched her approach. When she was close enough, he leaned forward and smelled her hair, then pulled back and sneezed, a short explosive sound that sent a lick of orange fire across the floor between them. Arya jumped back, delighted. "He breathes fire already. That was an accident, I think." Greysmoke looked mildly affronted at the suggestion. Arya put her hand out, palm up, the way Jon had showed her to approach strange horses. Greysmoke looked at the hand with the expression of something that had never been asked permission for anything in its life, but was choosing to respect the gesture anyway. He pressed the top of his head into her palm. Arya looked at Jon over Greysmoke's head. Her eyes were very bright. "You have to tell me everything," she said. "Right now, all of it." So Jon told her. Everything, the crypts, the stone, the hatching, the bones, all of it. Arya sat cross-legged on the floor with Greysmoke's head in her lap and Ghost pressed against her side, and she listened the way she never listened to lessons, with her whole body, interrupting only to ask questions that were always sharper than they had any right to be. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Greysmoke," she said, trying the name. The dragon's tail swept the floor once, slow, like a cat. "Arya," Jon hesitated. "You can't tell anyone." She looked at him with an expression that mixed hurt and incredulity in roughly equal proportions. "Jon, I'm not Sansa. That's not. Who would I tell? Mother would have him killed. Father would look worried and do nothing. Robb would want to turn." She looked back down at Greysmoke. "He's yours, he hatched for you." She said it simply, the way she said most important things, with no decoration on it. "Nobody gets to have him but you." Jon felt something in his chest loosen. He hadn't known it was tight until it wasn't. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said, scratching behind Greysmoke's jaw with the focused attention of someone doing important work. "Just let me visit." The concealment lasted 11 days after Arya found them. Jon had known it couldn't hold. Greysmoke was not a concealable thing. He was approaching horse size by the end of the 3rd week, and the room and the storage space had become functionally inadequate. The dragon could no longer fully extend his wings. which he had begun to do experimentally in the mornings, spreading them against the walls and examining them with the focused intensity of someone reading a particularly interesting document. He was eating more than Jon could supply. He had burned 3 different spots on the floor, not accidentally but the way a cat scratches furniture, not to damage, but because the action felt natural and right. And he was beginning to make sounds that carried. Not loud sounds. Not the roaring Jon had imagined. Those were still months away at least. But that low, resonant coal sound had deepened as he grew, and now when Greysmoke was content or communicating or simply existing in the full presence of being alive, the sound traveled through the castle's stone the way sounds carried through old buildings, touching other rooms, other corridors, arriving without source. Jon heard the servants talking about it first. Structural settling, one of them said. Old Nan said it was the old kings turning in their graves, which she said about most inexplicable sounds, and which was her default explanation for anything she found poetic. Maester Luwin looked thoughtful once, in the corridor near Jon's wing, in a way that made Jon move Greysmoke to the easternmost storage corridor that same afternoon. He couldn't move him far enough. He knew that. What actually broke the concealment was not a sound. It was Robb. Robb came to find him on the afternoon of the 4th week, because Robb always came to find him eventually, following the path of his own conscience and his genuine, if sometimes helpless, affection. Jon heard him in the corridor, heard the familiar footsteps and the familiar pause at Jon's door, and looked at Greysmoke and said, very quietly, "Stay," which was probably the single most optimistic thing he'd ever said in his life. Greysmoke looked at him and made the coal sound and did not stay, pushing past Jon with a shoulder check that nearly knocked Jon into the wall and standing in the doorway to the storage corridor looking at Robb. Robb had his hand raised to knock. He did not knock. He stood with his hand raised and his mouth open and looked at the dragon, who looked back. Jon took a breath, let it out. Robb. Robb's eyes moved from the dragon to Jon. They were stark eyes, gray and long, and right now about as wide as Jon had ever seen them. "Jon," Robb said, "what is that?" "His name is Greysmoke." Robb stopped. He was 11 years old and heir to the north, and he had been trained in composure since he could walk, but composure had its limits. "Jon, that is a dragon. Everyone keeps telling me that." "Jon." Robb's voice had moved from shock into something more complex, something that had history in it, the long history of being brothers in a house that kept telling them they were not quite brothers. "When did this? How long have you?" "A month," Jon said. Then, because Robb's expression was doing something painful, almost, Robb brought his hand down from the knock he'd never completed. He looked at Greysmoke, and Greysmoke looked at Robb with those pale silver eyes that were, by now, level with Robb's face. The dragon turned his head slowly to the side, examining. "He's not going to hurt you," Jon said. "I know that." Robb said it with a conviction that was either genuine or very well performed. Jon couldn't tell. Then he stepped forward and Greysmoke stepped forward, and they met in the middle of the corridor, and Greysmoke sniffed him, nose going along Robb's jaw and up through his hair, the way he'd sniffed Arya, the way he sniffed everything that came close to Jon. Robb stood very still through this. His hands were at his sides and his jaw was tight, and then Greysmoke pulled back and made the coal sound, brief and low, and turned and walked back through the storage room door like a conversation that had been had and needed no further comment. Robb looked at Jon. "He accepted me." "You're stark," Jon said. It came out more neutrally than he meant it. Robb heard the edge in it. He always did and always pretended he hadn't, but this time he didn't pretend. "Jon, I'm not saying it as an insult. I'm just saying why." Jon moved past him. "He likes Arya better." "Arya already knows." Robb ran a hand through his hair. "God's father needs to know." "I know. Mother needs know," Jon said. Robb stopped. "Your father," Jon said. "Not your mother. I'll tell Lord Stark myself." "Jon, she has a right to." She has no rights regarding me, Jon said, and the flatness of it silenced Robb completely. Not because Jon raised his voice, he didn't. Because the flatness was real, worn smooth by years of careful management, and it was the kind of real that couldn't be argued with. Greysmoke is mine. Lord Stark can know. After that, what happens is what happens, but she doesn't hear it first. She doesn't hear it from someone other than me. Robb looked at him for a long moment. In Robb's face, Jon could see the wrestling, the loyalty, the love, the deeply inconvenient awareness that Jon was right. "Okay," Robb said quietly. Jon nodded. In the storage room, Greysmoke made his sound. Ghost, somewhere down the corridor, answered it with silence. And somehow the silence was the same shape as the sound. And Jon stood in the narrow corridor of Winterfell with his brother and thought about the old kings in the deep dark below them and felt, for the second time since the hatching, something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was there. He would tell Lord Stark tomorrow. Tonight he sat with his dragon and his wolf and his sister, who climbed back through the window around supper time with a sack of stolen food and the absolute energy of someone who understood, at 7 years old, that they were living inside a story, and that the story had just truly begun. Greysmoke ate a whole roasted chicken in 2 bites. Ghost stole a bread roll. Arya ate cross-legged on the floor and told them both, with great authority, that she had read everything in Luwin's library about dragons, and that the Valyrians had used them as weapons of war and also as personal transportation, and also sometimes as a way to end arguments. "I like that last one," Jon said. "I thought you would," Arya said. She threw a chicken leg to Greysmoke. He caught it out of the air and looked smug about it. "Jon, what? Nobody's going to take him from you." Jon watched Greysmoke turn the chicken leg in his claws with the dexterity of something far more intelligent than a predator had any right to be. "They're going to try. Then they'll find out why that's a bad idea," Arya said simply, and went back to eating. Outside, the night fell over Winterfell the way it always did in the north, hard and fast, winter dark, starless under cloud. The castle's lights appeared one by one in the towers and the high windows. Down in the crypts, in the chamber with no name and no throne, the empty shell of a dragon's egg sat in its nest of black sand and old ash, in the cold, in the dark, done. It had waited a long time to be done. Jon pressed his back against Greysmoke's side and felt the warmth and the deep, steady heartbeat and the weight of something enormous beginning, and he breathed in and out, and let himself, for just this one night, feel nothing but the simple, extraordinary fact of not being alone. Chapter 2. Smoke and Testimony. Ned Stark was in the great hall when Jon came to find him. It was early, the kind of early that belonged to stewards and stable masters and men who had too much to think about to sleep past first light. The hall was empty except for Ned himself, sitting at the high table with a cup of ale he hadn't touched, and a letter from the south he'd read 3 times. The fire was low. The long benches threw shadows that ran the length of the room. Jon walked in and didn't stop. He'd learned, years ago, that the thing about entering a room as a bastard was that hesitation killed you. If you paused in the doorway, someone saw you pause, and the pause became permission to look through you, to turn back to their conversation, to make you feel the full weight of every legal and social distinction between yourself and the legitimate people in the room. So Jon had made it his practice to enter rooms like he intended to be in them, which was the closest thing he had to armor. He crossed the hall and stopped in front of his father. Ned looked up from the letter. He took in Jon's face, and something shifted in his own. Some careful composition breaking apart for just a moment before he put it back together. Jon had never been entirely sure what his father saw when he looked at him. Something that hurt, he thought, something that required managing. "Jon," Ned said, "you're up early. I need to show you something." Jon paused. "It can't wait. I've already waited too long." Ned set the letter down. He looked at his son, his bastard son, his sister's son, the secret in the deepest room of his chest, and he said, "Show me." They walked through Winterfell in the early quiet, and Jon felt his father's presence at his shoulder like a weather system, that particular combination of grief and love and restraint that Ned Stark carried with him everywhere, the way some men carried old wounds. Jon had grown up trying to decode it. He understood it better now. He didn't forgive it exactly, but he understood it, which was not nothing. He led Ned to his room first, pushed open the door, gestured to the empty space inside. "He's in the back," Jon said. "I moved him out of the room 2 weeks ago. He'd outgrown it." Ned looked at the room, the mess of straw and bones, the scorched spots on the floor, the shed scales caught in the gaps between stones, dark gray and glinting like iron, and his expression was doing several things at once. "Jon," he said, "just come." Jon pushed through to the storage corridor. Greysmoke was awake. He was always awake when Jon arrived, which Jon had decided was either a function of their bond or a function of Greysmoke never really sleeping deeply, existing instead in a state of restful alertness like a watchfire that never quite went out. The dragon was sitting up in the far corner, and in the growing morning light that came through the arrow slit Jon had widened with a chisel over 3 frustrating nights, Greysmoke looked exactly like what he was. He was the size of a draft horse now. Bigger, maybe. His wingspan, when he extended it, would span the storage corridor twice. His scales had deepened in the last week, the gray becoming layered and complex, not flat stone gray, but the gray of deep water or storm cloud, shifting with the light. His pale eyes found Ned Stark and did not waver. Ned Stark made a sound. Jon had never heard that sound from his father before. It was not quite a word and not quite a breath, something between them, the sound of a man whose composure had just met its absolute limit. "Gods," Ned said. "His name is Greysmoke," Jon said. "I found the egg in the crypts. In a chamber below the lower vaults. There's no marker, no name. He hatched 26 days ago." He paused. "He chose me. I wasn't looking for it. I want you to know that." Ned moved forward slowly. Greysmoke watched him the way he'd watched Robb, that slow, rotating examination, head tilting, pale eyes moving across the man in front of him like he was reading text. When Ned was close enough, the dragon leaned forward and pressed his nose to Ned's chest, directly over his heart, and held there. Ned's hand came up slowly, like a man moving in a dream, and rested on Greysmoke's jaw. They stayed like that for a moment. Something passed between them that Jon couldn't fully read, some wordless communication that felt older than language. "He's Valyrian," Ned said softly. "The egg, it was in the crypts." "Yes. The builders when they came north." Ned's voice was working through something, assembling a history. "Brandon the builder. There were Valyrian stonemasons, some accounts say. Some accounts say gifts were exchanged." He stepped back. He looked at Jon. "He hatched for you." "Yes." Ned was quiet. His face had gone through several iterations since they'd walked in and had landed somewhere Jon had never seen it before, a kind of raw and uncertain openness, like the man underneath the Lord of Winterfell had surfaced briefly and wasn't sure if it was safe. "How long have you known?" Ned asked. "Since the hatching." Jon met his father's eyes. "I know I should have told you immediately. I needed time with him first, before anyone else had an opinion about him." Ned looked at him. "An opinion? People are going to want to take him or use him or kill him because they're afraid of him. I needed to know him first, so I could." Jon stopped. He felt suddenly young, standing in the gray light with his dragon at his back and his father in front of him. He was 10 years old and he was having a conversation about political strategy. "So I could protect him." Ned Stark looked at his son for a long time. Something moved across his face, not quite shame, not quite grief, something more specific than either of those, something that had Jon's name on it and had been sitting in Ned's chest for years waiting for the right moment to surface. "I've failed you," Ned said. It came out quiet and direct, like he'd taken a run at saying it many times and this time had made it. Jon blinked. "My lord Ned," his father's voice was firm. "When it's just us, I've asked you before." "Ned," Jon said it. The name sat strangely in his mouth, not because it was new, but because it felt, right now, like it meant more than usual. You haven't failed me. Don't do that." Ned's jaw was tight. "Don't minimize it out of courtesy. You're down here in a storage room with a dragon because no one in this castle looks at you long enough to notice what's happening under their noses. That's not an accident, Jon. That's a consequence." Jon didn't answer immediately. He was aware of Greysmoke's warmth at his back, the steady, deep pulse of the dragon's presence. He was aware that this was not the conversation he'd prepared for. He'd prepared for practicality, for logistics, for the controlled revelation of the secret and the negotiation of what happened next. He had not prepared for his father to look at him like that. "What do we do?" Jon asked. Ned let out a long breath. He ran a hand over his face, a very unlordly gesture, a tired man gesture, and looked at Greysmoke, who had settled back into his corner but kept one eye on the conversation with obvious interest. "Maester Luwin needs to know. There's no avoiding it. He'll need to know about the health of the animal, what he eats, how to manage the—" Ned paused. "Can he fly yet?" "He's tried, small distances. He needs more space." Jon hesitated. "He's going to need the yard soon. He can't keep growing in a corridor." Ned said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "And Lady Stark?" Jon asked. Ned looked at him. "She'll hear eventually," Jon said, keeping his voice flat and even. "I'd rather she hear from you than from rumor, but I want to be clear about one thing." He held his father's gaze and didn't look away. "He's mine. Whatever she says, whatever she argues, whatever she tells you about the politics or the danger or the impropriety, he's mine and I won't give him up. I want you to know that before you walk into that conversation." Ned Stark looked at his bastard son, 10 years old, jaw set, standing in front of a dragon the size of a war horse with the absolute conviction of someone who has decided not to be afraid of anything anymore. And he said, very quietly, "I know." Catelyn Stark heard about the dragon from her maid, who had heard about it from a stable boy, who had heard from one of the kitchen girls who'd been walking past the eastern stores when the sound came through the wall, and she'd told half the castle before breakfast. Catelyn was in her solar when Ned came to her. She was already dressed and already furious, sitting very straight with her hands folded in her lap, and the expression on her face that she saved for moments when being angry was more powerful than showing it. Ned told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which was worse, somehow, than if she'd shouted. When he finished, she said, "Send it away." "Cat, send it away, Ned." Her voice was controlled, precise, the voice she used in negotiation. "I don't know how it got here, I don't know what that boy has done, and I am not accusing him, I am saying I don't know, but there is a dragon in my castle. Our children are here, our daughters, send it away." "There's nowhere to send it. The Night's Watch, they take men, not dragons, and Jon is 10 years old." "Then find somewhere," she stood. "I will not have," she stopped herself, reset. "Ned. This is a dragon. If it were any other child, any other ward, if it were anyone else, you would see how impossible this is." "It hatched for Jon," Ned said. "The egg was in our crypts. It was meant to be here. Nothing that gives that boy more power in this household was meant to be here." She said it with a clarity that was almost admirable and a complete lack of awareness that it was a terrible thing to say. Then something crossed her face and she pressed her lips together. "That came out poorly." "Yes," Ned said. "It did." The silence between them was the silence of a long marriage encountering one of its fault lines. "I want to speak with Luwin," Catelyn said finally. "And I want a guard on that wing." "I'll speak with Luwin." Ned moved to the door. "There will be no guard." She looked at him. "Ned, he's my son, Cat." Ned said it with a tiredness that was also, underneath the tiredness, a kind of bedrock. Whatever else you feel about him, he is my son and he has done nothing wrong. There will be no guard." He left. Catelyn sat back down. She looked at her folded hands for a long time. Maester Luwin came to see Greysmoke that afternoon and spent 4 hours in the storage corridor making notes and asking Jon questions in a voice that was working very hard to remain academic and not entirely succeeding. He was a small, tidy man with a chain around his neck and a mind like a well-organized archive, and his primary response to the impossible was to begin cataloging it, which Jon found genuinely comforting. "His growth rate is extraordinary," Luwin said, not for the first time, crouching to examine one of the shed scales. "In recorded history, young dragons at this stage, the accounts we have, which are admittedly incomplete, were perhaps half this size. The cold, perhaps, or the diet." "What exactly have you been feeding him?" "Bones from the lower crypts mostly, and whatever I could carry from the kitchens. He eats everything." "Everything," Luwin repeated. "He ate a knife once," Jon said. "By accident, I think." Luwin looked up at him, then he made a note. "Has he shown any sign of—" He gestured vaguely at Greysmoke's jaws. "He burned a spot on my floor. He sneezed fire at Arya. Lady Arya knows. She found him on her own." Luwin took a breath. "Who else?" "Robb, now you, Lord Stark." Luwin stood up, tucking his notes against his chest, and looked at Greysmoke with an expression Jon recognized. The expression of a man who has spent his life believing in the primacy of recorded knowledge encountering something that made all his records feel thin. "Jon," Luwin said carefully, "Maester, do you understand what this means? What he means not just to you, to Westeros." He was choosing his words with precision, the way he did in lessons when he wanted Jon to understand that he was being given something important. "There has not been a dragon in the known world since Drogon." He stopped himself. "Since the last Targaryen dragon died. The political implications alone—" "I know," Jon said. Luwin looked at him over his notes. Jon met the look without flinching. "I know," Jon said again, quieter. "I've thought about it. I think about it every day. But he's here and he's mine, and whatever it means to Westeros, right now it means that I need to know how to keep him healthy, how to feed him properly, and how long before he can fly properly." He paused. "That's what I need from you, not a history lesson." Luwin regarded him for a moment with something that might have been respect if he'd been the kind of man who expressed it directly. "I'll find what I can in the library," he said. "There are Valyrian texts I've never had cause to, that is, I'll find what I can." "Thank you." "Jon," Luwin hesitated, "be careful with Lady Stark." "I'm always careful." Luwin looked like he wanted to say more and decided against it. He gathered his notes and left, and Jon turned to Greysmoke, who had been watching the entire exchange with the focused attention of someone following a conversation in a second language. "You understood most of that, didn't you?" Jon said. Greysmoke opened his mouth and a small, precise stream of fire came out, approximately 2 feet long, then cut off. He looked at Jon. "Right," Jon said. "Start practicing." The household knew by nightfall. There was no containing it. The castle's grapevine moved at a speed that made ravens look slow. And once the kitchen girl had talked, and the stable boy had talked, and the guard who'd been asked to stand down had talked in the resentful way of men who have been stood down from an interesting post, the information was everywhere. Jon felt it before he saw any evidence of it. The castle had a texture, a particular way it felt to walk through its corridors and yards and halls, and that texture changed over the course of the afternoon in a way Jon had become sensitive to over years of being the person that texture changed around. Eyes at the corners. Conversations that stopped slightly too abruptly. The specific quality of silence that preceded either violence or wonder, which were sometimes the same thing. He was in the yard with Ghost when Jory Castle found him. Jory was the captain of Lord Stark's guard, young for the position, broad-shouldered, with a scar along his jaw in a manner that was direct without being unkind. He'd always treated Jon with a straightforwardness that Jon appreciated, no particular warmth but no contempt either, and in Winterfell's social architecture that was worth quite a lot. "My lord wants you in the great hall," Jory said. "You and—" he paused. "Should I say the dragon, or does he have a name?" "Greysmoke," Jon said. Jory repeated it, trying it out. "You and Greysmoke, then." Jon looked across the yard. "He won't fit in the hall." "The great hall he will." Lord Stark had the far doors opened. Jon nodded. He went to get the dragon. Getting Greysmoke through the castle was an experience. The corridors were the problem, not the width of them but the height, and Greysmoke's wings, which he carried half extended like a man walking in a room he wasn't sure was tall enough, brushing the walls and leaving scorch marks at irregular intervals when he brushed too hard. Jon walked at his shoulder, and the dragon stayed close, reading Jon's pace and direction with the constant low-level attention that had become the background music of Jon's life. Every servant they passed stopped. Every guard. One of the household maids, a woman who had been at Winterfell longer than Jon had been alive, made a sound in her throat and touched the old god's symbol at her neck, not in fear, Jon thought, but in something more complex, something with reverence in it. He thought of old Nan. He thought about being in a story. They came through the side entrance into the great hall. The hall had been set up like a small court, not formally, no throne arrangement. But Ned Stark stood at the high table with Robb at his right and Maester Luwin slightly behind. Lady Stark stood at the far edge of the table, composed and sharp, with the Septa Mording a step behind her. Several household knights and senior servants were arranged along the walls, far enough back to be audience rather than participants. Catelyn Stark saw Greysmoke come through the doors and she went absolutely still. Jon felt it, the stillness, the control it was costing her, the way the room's atmosphere changed around that stillness, the way weather changed around a mountain. He understood her in this moment. He even felt something not quite sympathy but adjacent to it. The fear was real, of course it was real. There was a dragon the size of a draft horse walking through her hall. The fear was legitimate. It was what she did with it that mattered. Greysmoke stopped in the middle of the hall and looked around with that slow, rotating attention, taking in the people, the space, the high stone ceiling, the dim light coming through the shuttered windows. His tail swept once. He made no sound. "Jon," Ned said, "thank you for coming." "My lord." Jon walked forward, stopping a few feet from the table. Greysmoke moved with him, and Jon felt the room's held breath sharpen. "I've asked the household to be present for this," Ned said, which was his way of making whatever happened official, making it witnessed, to understand what has happened and what it means going forward. He looked at Jon. "Will you tell them?" Jon told them. He'd gotten better at it since the third or fourth time. He kept it brief, the crypts, the egg, the hatching, the name. He didn't apologize for the concealment. He didn't perform any version of humility. He said what had happened and let the facts stand. When he finished, the room was quiet. Then Catelyn said, "And what do you intend to do with it?" Jon looked at her. "With him," a very small shift in her expression, "with him. I intend to raise him," Jon said. "He's mine. He'll stay at Winterfell for now. He needs the space, and he's still growing." Beyond that, Jon paused. "I'm 10 years old, Lady Stark. I'm not making 10-year plans." Something moved in her eyes. He'd surprised her, he thought. She'd expected either aggression or defensiveness, and he'd given her neither. "There are questions of safety," she said, "for the children." "He hasn't harmed anyone." Jon looked at Robb. "Tell her." Robb looked very slightly like he'd been put on the spot and very slightly like he deserved it. I met him. He was calm. He let me approach. He let Arya crawl through my window and use him as a pillow," Jon said. Someone along the wall, one of the younger guards, made a sound that might have been a laugh quickly suppressed. Catelyn's eyes moved to the wall and back. "Arya will not be using him as a pillow," Catelyn said. "I think," Jon said, "that's between Arya and Greysmoke." Catelyn looked at him. The look had layers to it, calculation on top, and underneath that the frustration of a woman who was accustomed to being the most politically composed person in a room and had just encountered a 10-year-old who was not going to give her any clean angles to work with. Ned stepped in. The dragon stays. Jon remains in the East Wing. Maester Luwin will document everything. We'll need to consider how to manage this when it becomes known beyond our walls. He looked at Jon. Which will happen? I know, Jon said. There are men who will want him, Ned said carefully, powerful men. Let them want, Jon said. Ned looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, a small gesture but a definite one. The household is dismissed, he said. Jon, stay a moment. The room emptied. Catelyn was the last to leave, and she looked at Greysmoke once more before she went. A long, measuring look. Not quite fear and not quite wonder and not quite calculation, but something that held all three. The doors closed behind her. Robb stayed. Ned nodded at him permission, and Robb moved to stand beside Jon, which was such a small thing and such a specific thing. The choice to stand beside rather than behind or apart, that Jon felt it like a hand on his shoulder. What powerful men, Jon said. Ned sat down. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was choosing between honesty and protection and deciding, this time, in favor of honesty. The king will hear about this, he said. Within a month, I'd estimate if we're lucky. 2 weeks if we're not. Robert loves me, Jon, but he has his history with dragons and with Targaryens. Ned stopped. The name landed in the room like a stone in still water. Jon watched the ripples. He watched his father's face. What about Targaryens? Jon said very carefully. Ned met his son's eyes. Something in his expression was doing something that Jon had never seen it do before, something that looked from the outside like the moment before a man steps off a ledge he's been standing on for a long time. Jon watched it happen, watched his father pull back from the edge. Nothing, Ned said. Only that Robert has his history. We'll need to manage how this information reaches him. He stood. I'll handle Robert. You handle Greysmoke. He left. Jon stood in the empty hall with Robb and the dragon, and the word Targaryens was still in the air between them. Greysmoke made the coal sound. It echoed up through the rafters, resonated in the old stones, and came back down, changed, deeper, more itself, like the hall was agreeing with something. He knows something, Robb said quietly. I know, Jon said. Robb looked at him. Does that bother you? Jon thought about the crypts, the dark, the stone that breathed. He thought about the way his father had almost said something and then hadn't, and the specific shape of the silence around the thing he hadn't said. It would have bothered me before, Jon said, before Greysmoke. He put his hand on the dragon's neck, feeling the warmth, the deep, patient pulse. Now it just feels like something I'll find out eventually. That's remarkably calm, Robb said. I have a dragon, Jon said simply. Robb was quiet. Then, helplessly, despite everything, he laughed. Jon smiled. Greysmoke turned his head and looked at both of them with the expression of something that was entirely used to being the most important thing in the room. That night, Jon lay on his back in the storage corridor with Greysmoke curled around him and Ghost against his other side, and listened to Winterfell settle. The castle had a voice at night, stone and timber contracting in the cold, the fires dying down, the last guards making their rounds. He'd listened to it his whole life. It had always sounded to him like a home that was not quite his. Tonight it sounded different. He wasn't sure when that had happened. Somewhere between walking into the great hall with a dragon at his shoulder and walking out without flinching, the castle's voice had shifted. Like a chord that had been slightly off, resolving, finally, into something true. He thought about Lady Stark's face. He thought about the look she'd given Greysmoke, calculation, fear, wonder. He had no illusions about what she was doing right now in her solar, at her writing desk. She was being intelligent. She was being politically strategic. She was doing what she always did when something threatened the arrangement she'd built around her children and her husband's name. She was planning. Jon looked up at the stones sailing and thought, "Good. Plan well." So am I. He wasn't angry. He was something colder and more useful than angry. He was the boy who had grown up invisible in this castle, who had read every book in Luwin's library because no one tracked what he took, who had learned everything about everyone because no one thought to watch what he noticed. He had spent 10 years becoming someone that no one looked at twice. That was over now. Greysmoke breathed, slow and deep, and the warmth of it moved through Jon like firelight through a window, and Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell, son of no one they'd yet admit to, closed his eyes and planned and was not afraid of anything at all. Chapter 3. The sky remembers the yard was not big enough. Jon had known this for a week before he finally admitted it out loud, standing at Greysmoke's shoulder in the pre-dawn dark, while the dragon paced the length of the eastern training yard, 40 feet end to end, and turned at the wall with a frustration that was visible in every line of his body. His wings kept spreading involuntarily great gray arcs that knocked snow from the battlements when he got too close to the walls, and each time they spread and found no space, Greysmoke made a sound that was not the coal sound. It was something sharper, something urgent. He needed sky. "I know," Jon told him. "Tomorrow." Greysmoke turned at the wall again and paced back, and the sound came again. And Ghost, sitting at the yard's edge, watched the dragon with his red eyes and made no noise at all, which was its own kind of commentary. Jon had been negotiating the logistics of it for 3 days. He'd mapped the land north of Winterfell, not formally. He didn't have a Meister's surveying tools, but he'd ridden that country enough to know it in his bones. 2 miles north and west, past the King's Road, the farmland gave way to open moorland that stretched for miles before hitting the edge of the Wolfswood. Flat, empty, far enough from the castle that the sight of a dragon in the air would not immediately empty Winterfell of its garrison. He'd told Ned. Ned had said yes, which Jon had expected, and then had said he'd send Jory Castle, which Jon had also expected, and then had said perhaps a larger escort, 6 or 8 men, which Jon had pushed back on. 4, Jon had said. Jory and 3, more than that draws attention on the road. Ned had looked at him. "You're planning to ride outside the walls." "He needs to fly," Jon said. "He can't fly inside the walls." "Jon, you're Ned." Jon had used the name deliberately. "I know I'm 10. I also have a dragon. The two things coexist." He'd held his father's gaze. 4 men. "I know the country north of the castle better than any of them. Let me do this." Ned had agreed to 4. So on the morning of the 34th day since the hatching, before the castle was properly awake, Jon brought Greysmoke through the gates of Winterfell for the first time. The gates opened, and Greysmoke walked through them and stopped. Jon stopped with him. He understood the pause. The world beyond Winterfell's walls was enormous in a way that no description prepared you for if you'd grown up inside those walls, and Greysmoke had never seen sky that wasn't framed by stone. He'd never felt wind that wasn't filtered through corridors and arrow slits. He'd never seen the world in the horizontal, without edges, going on in every direction until it hit the horizon and kept going. The dragon stood in the gateway with the pre-dawn cold on his scales and the open country stretching north ahead of him, and he was very still. And in that stillness, Jon felt something through the bond that he didn't have a word for. It was enormous. It was basic. It was the feeling of something coming home to a place it had never been but had always been missing. Greysmoke opened his mouth and breathed fire into the dark sky. Not the short, careful streams he'd been practicing in the storage corridor. This was full and real, and it lit the country ahead of them in a brief, extraordinary orange, turning the snow gold and the darkness amber for 3 full seconds before dying. Behind Jon, he heard one of the 3 guards Jory had selected exhale hard. "Right," Jory said. "North, then." They rode north on the King's Road with Greysmoke moving alongside the horses, his stride covering ground faster than it looked like it should. The horses, which Luwin had spent a week acclimatizing to the dragon's smell, managing it with varying degrees of success. The sky lightened from black to deep blue to gray as they went, the sun not yet up but visible as a brightening in the east, and Greysmoke moved faster as the light grew, his head up, his wings spreading and closing, testing the air. The moorland opened up around them a mile north of the King's Road turn, and Jon pulled his horse up and looked at the flat expanse of it, snow-covered, windswept, empty in every direction. The tree line a dark smudge to the north and the distant shape of Winterfell's towers to the south, small now, made humble by the space. He dismounted. Greysmoke was already ahead of him, moving into the open ground, and Jon jogged to keep pace and put his hand on the dragon's flank and felt the readiness in him, every muscle coiled, wings trembling. "Go," Jon said. Greysmoke ran. 6 strides, 7, and then the wings came down in one enormous stroke that threw Snow outward in a circle and pushed Jon back a step. And on the second stroke the dragon was up, 5 feet off the ground, 10, the wings working with a power that was audible even from below, a deep concussive sound like the world being pushed aside. He climbed. 20 feet. 40. His silhouette against the brightening sky, the long neck, the folded tail, the wingspan that was already wider than most men would ever stand close to, turned in a long arc north and then banked east, climbing still, finding the cold air above the moorland and using it the way Jon had watched hawks use thermals, tilting and rising without apparent effort. At 200 feet he leveled out and flew east, and Jon watched him and could not speak. He tried later with Arya to explain what it was like. He was never entirely satisfied with his explanation. The closest he came was, it felt like watching a proof, like something that had always been true becoming visible. Greysmoke in the air was not the dragon learning to fly, it was the dragon being finally exactly what he was. The ground had been a constraint, the air was home. Jon turned to find Jory Castle standing at his shoulder, neck craned back, watching. 7 hells, Jory said quietly. Yes, Jon said. He's fast. I know. Greysmoke had gone perhaps a mile east and was coming back now, lower, adjusting his angle, and Jon felt through the bond the precise and specific joy of speed, cold air, the whole world laid out below. A joy so pure and so physical it made Jon's chest tight with it, with the borrowed experience of it. This emotion that was not quite his and was also entirely his. The dragon came back over them at maybe 60 feet, and the sound of his wings was everything. The air rushing through the primary feathers of those great gray spans, the concussion of each downstroke, and then he was past them and banking north again, climbing, and the guard who was not Jory said something that Jon thought might have been a prayer. They stayed on the moor for 3 hours. Greysmoke landed twice, once to drink from a frozen stream he'd found by following it through the snow, cracking the ice with one precise tap of his foreleg, and once to rest, sprawled across the snow with his wings spread wide and his eyes closed, and the sun, which had finally come up, doing nothing at all for him in the way of warmth. The cold seemed to bother him less and less as he grew, as though the fire inside him was calibrating to the exterior temperature and adjusting accordingly. Jon sat on the dragon's back the way he'd sat on his horse and looked out at the moorland and felt, for the first time, like this was the correct scale of the world. Everything previous had been too small. On the 3rd hour he heard hoofbeats. There were 7 riders coming hard from the south on the King's Road. Jon had them in sight a full minute before they reached the turn. The moorland gave long sight lines in every direction, one of the reasons he'd chosen it, and he sat on Greysmoke's back and watched them come and felt the dragon's attention shift and sharpen beneath him. Greysmoke rose to his feet. His head came up. The pale eyes fixed on the approaching riders with an attention that was completely different from the distracted openness of flight. This was the attention of a predator assessing a situation, rapid and thorough. Jory pulled his horse up at Jon's side. "Riders from Winterfell," he said, squinting. "I recognize that's Lord Stark's banner." Jon watched them come. 7 riders was not a small escort. Ned had not said anything about following them out. Jon felt something crystallize in the back of his mind. The instinct that had been growing in him since the hatching and that was becoming more reliable by the day. The instinct that distinguished between things that were happening and things that were being made to happen, between coincidence and maneuver. Someone had come to Winterfell. The riders reached the moor's edge and slowed, and Jon could see Ned at their head, and beside Ned, 2 men Jon didn't recognize, well-mounted, well-dressed, with the look of people who had ridden fast and far and had more status than they were showing. One was older, gray-bearded, wearing a chain at his collar. The other was young, 20 or so, with sharp eyes that had already found Jon and were now moving to Greysmoke and staying there. Ned reached Jon first. His horse was reluctant to come close to Greysmoke, doing the sidestep dance that horses did, and Ned reined it with practiced force and looked at his son. "Word came this morning," he said. "A raven from White Harbor. Lord Manderley received word from King's Landing, a trader's account of something extraordinary in the north. It's vague enough that we have perhaps 2 weeks before anyone acts on it." He paused. "But there's something else. These men came from Bear Island." The older man with the chain rode forward. His collar marked him as a Meister. Behind him, the young man with the sharp eyes hadn't looked away from Greysmoke for a moment. "I'm Meister Tybalt," the older man said, "in service to House Mormont of Bear Island. I was sent ahead." He looked at Greysmoke with the academic fascination of Luwin, but harder-edged, more urgent. "The stories that came to us, we dismissed them initially. We sent to confirm." He looked at Jon. "You're Lord Stark's, Jon," Jon said, "and this is Greysmoke." Tybalt looked at the dragon. Greysmoke looked back. "Extraordinary," Tybalt said softly, and reached for his notes in the way that learned men always reached for their notes when confronted with something that exceeded their framework, and Jon felt a sudden liking for the old Meister. The young man rode forward. He was lean and direct, and his eyes had the quality of someone who made decisions quickly and stood by them. "Dacey Mormont," he said, then corrected. "Sir Dacey, Lady Mormont's eldest. I came myself because my mother said she'd skin me if I didn't." He looked at Jon with an openness that was also an evaluation. "She wants to meet you." "Lady Mormont," Jon said. "Lyanna," Dacey said. "She's 10, same as you. She's been running Bear Island since she could walk near enough." He paused. "She also said, and this is a direct quote, that a boy with a dragon is either the best thing to happen to the North in 100 years or the worst, and she intends to make the determination in person." Jon looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Ned, who had the expression of a man who had not expected this particular complication, but was reassessing it. Then he looked back at Dacey Mormont. "Tell Lady Lyanna," Jon said, "that she's welcome at Winterfell. I'd like to meet her too." Dacey nodded like a bargain had been struck. He looked at Greysmoke. "Can I?" "No," Greysmoke said. Or not quite that, but he turned his head away from Dacey with an absolute finality that communicated clearly that the audience had ended. Jon didn't apologize for it. "He decides," Jon said. Dacey looked at the dragon, looked at Jon, and said, "Fair enough," with the respect of a man who understood hierarchies clearly. The ride back to Winterfell had a different weight to it. Jon rode on Greysmoke's back now, properly, sitting between the rising ridges at the base of the dragon's neck. because Greysmoke had positioned himself so unmistakably and specifically beneath Jon after the landing that the only alternatives were getting on or being rude about it. The height was different from a horse. Everything was. The stride was longer, more flowing, the ground further away, and the people he rode alongside were, for the first time, looking up at him. He watched the Mormont riders watching him and understood something he hadn't understood before. He'd been thinking about this wrong. The revelation of Greysmoke, the household confrontation, Catelyn's opposition. He'd been thinking of those as problems to survive, obstacles between him and the quiet life he wanted, which was himself and his dragon and the people who genuinely gave a damn about him. He'd been thinking defensively. He should be thinking about the North. The Mormonts had come from Bear Island in 3 days, which meant hard riding, which meant they'd sent the moment the rumor reached them. And the rumor had reached them, which meant it had reached other houses too, Umber, Karstark, Glover, Flint, all the northern houses that sent ravens to each other with the constant low-level political chatter that maintained the North's internal relationships. They were all going to have opinions about this. They were all going to send someone, eventually, to look. And the question of what they found when they looked was not going to be answered by Ned Stark's diplomacy or Catelyn's strategy or Maester Luwin's careful documentation. It was going to be answered by Jon, by what he was, by whether he looked like someone worth following. He straightened his back. He looked ahead at Winterfell's towers appearing above the tree line, solid and old against the gray sky. Greysmoke felt the change in him. The dragon's pace shifted, picked up, a subtle adjustment in the carriage of his head. "We're going to have visitors," Jon said quietly, low enough that only the dragon could hear. Greysmoke made the coal sound. "I know you like visitors," Jon said. "Not always for the right reasons." The coal sound again, distinctly smug. Lyanna Mormont arrived at Winterfell 3 days later with her mother Meege, 6 household guards, and an attitude that filled rooms before she entered them. She was, as Daisy had said, 10 years old. She was also the most self-possessed person Jon had met outside of his own father, a small, dark-haired girl with gray eyes and a jaw set like carved stone, wearing riding leathers that had actual use wear on them rather than the decorative roughness that Southrun ladies sometimes affected. She walked into the courtyard, looked at Winterfell with the specific expression of someone cataloging the ways a fortification could be improved, and then looked at Jon. Then she looked at Greysmoke, who was lying along the eastern wall in the morning sun with Ghost asleep against his chest, and doing his best impression of something that had always been there, and was very comfortable about it. Lyanna Mormont said. "Lady Mormont," Jon said. "Jon Snow." She said it like she was reading something official. Then, "Walk with me." It was not a request. Jon walked with her, and he was amused to find that her stride was exactly as direct as her manner. She cut across the courtyard in a straight line, not navigating around people but letting people navigate around her, which they did. Sir Roderick Castle pulled a group of training boys out of her path without any apparent awareness that he was doing it. They stopped near the stables, far enough from the courtyard crowd for the conversation to be private. Meege Mormont stayed back with Ned, which Jon noticed. She'd engineered this deliberately. Lyanna looked up at him. She was slightly shorter, which she acknowledged with the absolute indifference of someone who had never found height to be a meaningful variable. "My mother thinks Lord Stark will try to manage this quietly until the king arrives," she said. "Contain it. Make it political in the careful way. Introduce you to Robert as his ward or his." She stopped. "What are you exactly to Lord Stark?" "His bastard son," Jon said, "but not by birth." Jon went very still. "What do you mean?" Lyanna looked at him with those gray eyes. "My mother knows things," she said. "Old things." She knew Lord Eddard Stark before the rebellion. She knew his sister. She paused, and the pause was weighted, deliberate. She says Lord Stark's sister had dark hair and dark eyes and a laugh like a wolf, and she says when she looks at you she wonders. The morning felt very cold for a moment. That's not a conclusion, Jon said carefully. No, Lyanna agreed. It's an observation. She turned to look at Greysmoke across the yard, and her face did something interesting. The armor of composure dropped for just a moment, and underneath it was a 10-year-old girl looking at a dragon. He's bigger than I thought. He keeps growing. Can he fight? He can already burn things. He's still learning what he can do. What about you? She looked back at him. Can you fight? Jon thought about the yard, the training sessions with Robb and Theon and the guardsmen, the care he'd always taken to be good without being noticeably better than the people who had reasons to resent him. Yes, he said, and dropped the qualification he would previously have attached to it. Something in Lyanna's expression adjusted, calibrated. Bear Island has no dragons, she said. We have axes and hard winters and a shoreline that teaches you either to swim hard or to drown. We're not large, but we keep our word. She said it like a covenant. Bear Island remembers its debts. Bear Island remembers its oaths. Jon understood what she was offering. He understood it clearly, and it surprised him that he did, that the political language landed for him so naturally, so immediately. He felt Greysmoke's warmth from across the yard, steady and present. I haven't asked for oaths, Jon said. No, she said. You haven't, that's why I'm offering. She held out her hand, a small, calloused hand, a hand that had clearly been doing real work since it was old enough to hold things. My mother says I'm too young to make political commitments. Her chin came up. My mother is also here, which tells you what she actually thinks. Jon looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He took her hand and shook it once firm. Lyanna Mormont, he said. Jon Snow, she said. They were 10 years old, and the handshake was the most serious thing either of them had done, and they both knew it. That evening Ned held a small dinner, the Mormonts, his own family, Maester Luwin, Jory Castle. It was not a formal feast. Just the long table in the family dining room with enough food and a fire going well, and the particular atmosphere of people who were all navigating several conversations simultaneously. Catelyn sat at Ned's left and managed the dinner with her usual precision, and Jon watched her work and had to acknowledge, privately, that she was very good at it. She made Midge Mormont feel honored without being flattered. She redirected conversations that were heading somewhere she didn't want them to go with such elegant timing that most people didn't notice the redirection at all. She was doing it to him twice before he fully tracked it. A shift in topic when asked Jon directly about the hatching. A turn toward Robb when the conversation came close to succession implications. The third time, Jon redirected it back. Lady Mormont was asking about the hatching, he said, during a half-beat in the conversation where Catelyn had drawn Midge toward a discussion of the Ironborn raids on the Bear Island coast. He said it pleasantly. He said it looking at Midge, not at Catelyn. Midge Mormont smiled. She had her daughter's eyes, gray and direct, and she had 40 years of running an island that backed onto the sea and fronted onto the North's internal politics. And the smile told Jon she'd noticed the redirection and the counter-redirection both. The hatching, Midge said. Tell me about it. Jon told her. He watched Catelyn's expression at the edge of his vision, controlled, contained, a small tightening around the eyes that she managed away before anyone who wasn't paying close attention would notice. He was paying close attention. After the dinner, after the Mormonts had been shown to their rooms and the children had been sent to bed, Jon found himself in the corridor outside the dining room with Ned, the two of them standing in the guttering light of a torch that needed replacing. She's going to write to the other houses, Jon said. Lady Stark, she might already have. Ned looked at him. You don't know that. I know that's what I would do, Jon said, if I were her, and I wanted to manage the situation before it managed me. He leaned against the wall. She's not wrong to try. I'm not angry about it. I just want to know what she's saying. Ned was quiet. I'm not asking you to spy on your own wife, Jon said. I'm asking you to be honest with me about what's happening. Another silence, longer. She's written to the Tullys, Ned said. Her uncle Brynden, seeking advice on the legal status of a bastard's claim to property discovered on a lord's land. He said it flatly, reporting facts. She also wrote to Lysa. Jon absorbed this. The Eyrie. Lady Lysa Arryn, Catelyn's sister, whose husband had been the king's hand before his death. A woman with connections to King's Landing and a history of being manageable. That's careful, Jon said. Yes, Ned said. She's trying to establish that he belongs to you, Jon said. To the Stark name, not to me. Ned's jaw tightened. She doesn't have grounds. She doesn't need grounds, Jon said. She needs precedent. She needs enough legal uncertainty to make a conversation with the king complicated. He looked at his father. How long do we have before Robert's Raven? Days, Ned said. Perhaps a week. Jon nodded. He pushed off the wall. He was tired and Greysmoke was waiting, and tomorrow Lyanna Mormont wanted to watch him fly again, and Jon had promised to take her across the moor on horseback with an escort and show her what open sky looked like from below when a dragon filled it. He stopped at the corridor's turn. Ned. Jon. Whatever she's planning, Lady Stark, whatever it is, she should know that Greysmoke is mine and that won't change. He said it without heat. The law can say what it wants. He hatched for me. He breathes for me. No document and no king changes that, and anyone who tries to find out if I'm bluffing will learn I'm not. Ned looked at his son in the torchlight, and again that expression crossed his face. The one that was almost shame and almost grief and almost something else. Something that Jon still didn't have a name for but that he'd begun, recently, to think was love. Not the uncomplicated love of easy relationships, but the love of a man who knew he owed more than he'd paid and kept encountering the interest. I know, Ned said for the second time. Jon walked back to his dragon, and the corridors were cold and long, and the castle spoke in stone and wind, and none of it felt like somewhere he could be made small anymore. Greysmoke was awake when he arrived. Of course he was. The pale eyes found Jon in the dark, and the coal sound came, low and warm, and Jon lay against the dragon's side and looked at the ceiling and thought about ravens flying south and lords opening letters and the specific expression on Lyanna Mormont's face when she'd looked at Greysmoke that first time, the armor dropping, the 10-year-old underneath. He thought, the North is going to have to decide what it thinks about this. He thought, I'm going to make the decision easy. Above Winterfell, somewhere in the dark between the towers, Greysmoke had left 3 long scorch marks on the eastern wall on their return, black lines against gray stone, visible now in the moonlight, and the snow in the yard below still bore the circle print of that first great wingbeat from the morning, the snow blown out in a perfect ring 30 feet wide. The castle wore the evidence of him now. The stones had accepted it the way stones accepted everything, completely, permanently, without any possibility of pretending otherwise. Jon closed his eyes and let the bond settle over him like a second skin, warm and absolute, and slept. Chapter 4. The Imp and the Dragon. The Raven from King's Landing arrived on a Tuesday, which Jon only remembered because Maester Luwin had been in the middle of his weekly astronomy lesson when the bird came in, and the lesson never resumed. Jon was in the yard when he heard the commotion, not a visible commotion, not shouting or running, but the particular shift in a castle's ambient noise that happened when important information arrived and began spreading. Conversations dropping in volume, footsteps changing direction. The specific silence of people who had just heard something and were deciding who else needed to hear it. He finished what he was doing, which was working through sword forms with Greysmoke watching from the eastern wall, and sheathed his sword and walked to the Maester's tower. Lewin was at his desk with the Raven's message and 2 other letters and a look on his face that Jon had learned to read accurately. It meant the situation had become considerably more complex while Jon wasn't watching. "The king is coming," Jon said. It wasn't a question. Lewin looked up. "3 ravens," he said. "One from King's Landing, Robert himself, or at least dictated by him, which amounts to the same thing. One from Lord Manderley at White Harbor, offering the king use of his harbor and his guest rode north. And one," he hesitated, "one from a somewhat unexpected source." He held out the 3rd letter. Jon took it. The seal was a lion, which meant Lannister, and the handwriting was small and precise and slightly irregular in a way that suggested it had been written by someone compensating for an uncomfortable position. Jon read it. "To the bastard of Winterfell, whose dragon I have heard described by 3 different travelers in as many weeks, each account more extraordinary than the last, greetings. I am Tyrion Lannister, 3rd child of Lord Tywin Lannister of Casterly Rock, currently traveling north for my own amusement and the edification of my mind. I intend to visit the Wall, as I have always found the ends of the world more interesting than their middles. I will pass through Winterfell in approximately 12 days. I would very much like to meet your dragon. I would also, if you're willing, like to meet you. I have a strong feeling we have a great deal to discuss. TLPS, I am not my father. I find it useful to establish this early." Jon read it twice. He folded it carefully and put it in his jacket. "When does the king arrive?" "Perhaps 3 weeks, Lewin said. "He travels with a full royal procession. Lord Manderley's letter suggests his party numbers in the hundreds. So Tyrion Lannister arrives before the king, by about a week if his estimate is accurate." Jon looked at the desk, at the other 2 letters, at Lewin's face. "Has Lord Stark seen these?" "He's reading the king's letter now." "And Lady Stark?" Lewin's expression gave him the answer without words. Jon nodded once and left. He found Ned in his solar, standing at the window that looked north, the king's letter in his hand, and the look on his face of a man watching an avalanche he'd been expecting for a long time arrive at the speed he'd always feared it would. He didn't turn when Jon entered, but he said, "You've heard," which meant he'd heard Jon's footsteps the way fathers learn to hear their children's footsteps. "Lewin told me." Jon came to stand beside him, not behind, not in the deferent position, but beside. 3 weeks. "About that. Robert wants to see Greysmoke." Ned made a sound that was agreement in something more complicated. He turned from the window. He looked tired in a way that had accumulated, that had layers of old tired under the new tired. "Robert is, you have to understand what Robert was before he was a king, what he was to me. He's not a stupid man. He's not a cruel man, but he carries his history the way some men carry old wounds, and his history with dragons is Targaryen history," Jon said. Ned went still. "You keep almost saying it," Jon said, keeping his voice entirely even. "You've almost said it 4 times since Greysmoke hatched. I haven't pushed because I thought you'd get there on your own." He looked at his father. "But if Robert Baratheon is riding north with a royal procession and whatever's in his head about dragons, I need to know everything before he gets here. Not some of it. Everything." Ned set the king's letter on his desk. He sat down. He looked at the fire for a long moment in the way of a man who has been carrying something heavy for so long that the prospect of setting it down is as frightening as the weight itself. "Sit down," Ned said. "Tell me standing," Jon said. I'm not angry, Ned. I just need to know." Another long silence. The fire cracked. Outside, somewhere over the castle, Greysmoke called, not the coal sound, something higher, a sound he made sometimes when he was flying and the air was cold and fast and everything was right with the world. Jon felt it through the bond that borrowed joy and let it steady him. Ned said, "Your mother's name was Lyanna." The room got very quiet. "She was my sister," Ned said. "She was taken, or she went. The histories disagree and the truth is somewhere between them. She went with Rhaegar Targaryen, Prince Rhaegar, before the rebellion, while she was promised to Robert. He stopped. She died at the Tower of Joy. I was there. I was the one who. He stopped again. She made me promise to keep you safe. She said Robert would kill you if he knew. She said your name was. His voice dropped. She gave you a name, a Valyrian name. I never used it. I told everyone you were mine, born of a woman who died. I gave you the name Snow because I had to give you something and I couldn't give you your real one. Jon stood very still. Your father was Rhaegar Targaryen, Ned said. Crown Prince of the Seven Kingdoms, the last of his line or nearly, which means you are. He stopped, and the stopped sentence had everything in it. Jon breathed in, breathed out. He thought about the stone in the dark. He thought about the warmth of recognition. Something in the world is glad you exist. He thought about Greysmoke hatching into his hands with those pale silver eyes and the name arriving like something he'd always known. He thought, of course. What name? Jon said. What name did she give me? Ned looked at him. Aegon, he said. Aegon Targaryen. The name moved through Jon like a key in a lock. He felt it, not transformation, nothing so dramatic, but recognition, the same recognition as the crypts, the same recognition as the hatching, something clicking into place that had always been slightly off. He did not say the name aloud. Not yet. He filed it carefully in the part of himself that processed important things in its own time. Robert can't know, Ned said. Jon, if Robert knows your parentage, he will kill you. I have spent 11 years keeping this secret because that is the truth of it, plain as stone. He may be my friend, but he hates everything Targaryen. He will not see a boy. He will see a rival. He will see Rhaegar's son. He's going to see a dragon, Jon said. Ned blinked. He's already coming because of the dragon, Jon said. He doesn't know my parentage and he's already riding north with a full royal procession. The dragon is the problem, not my name. He moved to the window, looked out at the gray sky. Greysmoke doesn't hide. I won't make him hide. So when Robert arrives and sees what he sees, I need to be someone he decides not to kill. He turned back. That's the problem we're actually solving. Ned looked at his son, Lyanna's son, Rhaegar's son, the boy he'd called his own for 11 years, and the pride in his face was naked and painful and real. How? Ned asked. I'm working on it, Jon said. Tyrion Lannister arrived on a gray afternoon with a small retinue and a mule he seemed genuinely fond of. And he was nothing at all like Jon had expected, and exactly like the letter had suggested. He was a dwarf, something Jon had known from description but which landed differently in person, the way most things did. He had mismatched eyes, one green and one black, and a face that had too many things happening in it simultaneously. Humor, intelligence, calculation, and a bone-deep wariness that it took Jon a moment to identify because he was so accustomed to seeing it in his own mirror. It was the wariness of someone who'd been underestimated their entire life and had learned to make a weapon of it. He rode through Winterfell's gates, looked around the courtyard with the comprehensive attention of a man cataloging assets, and then his eyes found Greysmoke on the eastern wall, and he stopped the mule entirely and simply stared. Greysmoke stared back. The moment held for a long count of 5. Then Tyrion Lannister said, to no one in particular, "Well, the world just got considerably more interesting." He dismounted with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd made peace with the geometry of dismounting long ago, handed his reins to a groom who was trying not to stare at either the dwarf or the dragon, and walked directly toward Jon. "You're the boy," he said. It wasn't insulting, just direct. "I'm Jon," Jon said. "Tyrion Lannister." He looked up at Jon with those mismatched eyes. "You're taller than I expected. The accounts I received described you as roughly the size of the dragon. Travelers exaggerate in both directions, I find." He looked back at Greysmoke. "How old is he?" 6 weeks tomorrow." Tyrion turned back to Jon with an expression of pure disbelief. 6 weeks, he's the size of a house. He eats a lot, I imagine. Tyrion tilted his head, still studying the dragon. He's watching me. He watches everyone. Does he always look like he's deciding something? Usually. Tyrion nodded slowly, the nod of a man processing information at speed and finding it satisfactory. I'd like to talk to you, he said. Privately, if possible, and soon. I have information about what's coming from the south that you'll want, and I suspect you have information about what's happening in the north that I'd find illuminating. He paused. I'm also, I'll admit, simply desperate to get a closer look at the dragon. I've read everything written about them, and I'm finding that the texts were inadequate. Jon looked at him. He trusted his instincts now in a way he hadn't before Greysmoke. The bond had sharpened him in ways he was still mapping, made him more sensitive to the texture of people, the way Greysmoke read everything with those pale eyes. Tyrion Lannister was not entirely trustworthy, but he wasn't performing. The intelligence was real and the curiosity was real, and the warning embedded in I have information about what's coming was also real. Tonight, Jon said. After dinner. Tyrion smiled. It changed his face entirely, made it younger and warmer, and the wariness retreated just enough to see the man underneath. Excellent. He looked at Greysmoke one more time. Does he have a name? Greysmoke. Tyrion tasted the name. Fitting. He looked at the dragon's eyes, pale and silver and fixed on him. He knows I'm not a threat, doesn't he? He's not tense, he's just interested. He's interested in most people, Jon said, right up until they do something that changes that. And then, Jon looked at the dragon. Then he's considerably less interested. Tyrion laughed, a genuine laugh, short and real. I'll endeavor to stay interesting in the non-threatening way. He turned toward the great hall, then stopped. One more thing. My nephew is traveling with the king's procession, Joffrey. His voice changed very slightly on the name, just enough to hear. He is. He appeared to search for diplomatic language and abandoned the search. He is a problem, and he's going to want to demonstrate something in front of the dragon. I am warning you because I would like you to have the opportunity to manage it before it escalates to a point where the dragon manages it for you. Jon filed this carefully. What kind of problem? The kind that was never told, no, Tyrion said, by anyone who was both willing and capable of making it stick. He held Jon's gaze for just a moment. I suspect you'll have a different experience. He walked away toward the great hall, and Jon watched him go, and Greysmoke made a low sound that Jon had started to associate with the dragon revising his assessment of someone upward. They met in the small library off the Maester's Tower that night, Jon and Tyrion, and a flagon of Winterfell's best wine, which Tyrion examined with the polite disappointment of a Southron man encountering northern hospitality for the first time. It's fine, Tyrion said, pouring anyway. I don't drink wine, Jon said. I'm aware. I'm drinking for both of us. He settled into the chair on the far side of the table with the particular arrangement of small people in chairs designed for larger ones, comfortable enough, unbothered by the fit. He looked at Jon. The king is coming to see the dragon and to decide what to do with you. In that order of priority. Robert loves Ned Stark and trusts him, but he hasn't survived 20 years of Lannister politics by ignoring things that could be problems. A dragon in the north is a problem. I know, Jon said, what you may not know, what I'm going to tell you because frankly I'm curious how you handle it and because I believe in backing interesting horses, is that there are at least 2 separate interests that would prefer you not be alive when the king arrives. Tyrion said it conversationally, the way you might mention weather. One of them is obvious and domestic. One of them is in my family. Jon went still. Explain the second one. My father, Tyrion said. Lord Tywin Lannister does not leave power centers unaccounted for. A dragon in the north bonded to the bastard son of Ned Stark, who is, however inconveniently, also the best friend of the king, is a power center that my father will want to either acquire or eliminate. Since acquisition requires your cooperation and my father has never been good at asking nicely, the second option is more likely. He drank his wine. I do not like my father. You said you weren't him, Jon said. I'm demonstrably not, Tyrion said, gesturing at himself with the wine cup. In more ways than one. He leaned forward. There's a man named Syrio. He stopped. Forgive me, that's not relevant yet. What's relevant is that I believe someone in the procession, not my father, he wouldn't come north himself, but someone who serves him is carrying instructions. He looked at Jon carefully. You should increase your personal guard. Greysmoke is my personal guard, Jon said. Tyrion blinked. Then he sat back. Yes, he said slowly. Yes, I suppose he is. He turned his wine cup in his hands. That does rather change the calculus. I wonder if whoever has the instructions has properly accounted for that. They haven't, Jon said. How do you know? Because people who haven't seen him in person think of him as a powerful animal, Jon said. Like a trained bear. Something impressive but manageable. He looked at Tyrion steadily. He's not that. Tyrion was quiet for a moment, looking at Jon with those mismatched eyes. No, he said, I don't think he is. A pause. What is he? He's Greysmoke, Jon said simply. Tyrion smiled again, the real one. You know, he said, I came north because I was bored and because the wall has always fascinated me as a feat of engineering, and because I was tired of listening to my sister explain things to me that I'd understood faster than her 3 explanations ago. He drank. But I think the wall is going to have to wait. He looked at Jon over the rim of his cup. How old are you exactly? 10. 10, Tyrion repeated, in a tone that managed to express several things at once. And you've already mapped the politics of this situation more accurately than most men twice your age would manage. He set the cup down. I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it properly. Not as flattery, because I don't flatter people. It's not worth the investment. I'm going to tell you this as a simple observation from a man who has spent his entire life studying people as a survival mechanism. He looked at Jon. Whatever you are, whoever you actually are, because I have my own suspicions about that. And yes, the dragon is a significant data point. The world is not ready for you. That's not a warning, that's information. The world wasn't ready for Aegon the Conqueror either, and he found that to be someone else's problem. The name landed. Jon felt his face stay still, which cost something. Tyrion watched him. I'm not asking, Tyrion said quietly. I'm telling you I've thought about it. You don't have to confirm anything. He picked his wine up again. Not tonight. Jon looked at the fire. At the shadows it made on the old library walls. The shelves of books that nobody here read, the accumulated knowledge of generations that Luwin kept dusted and mostly untouched. He thought about Aegon. He thought about Lyanna Mormont's handshake. He thought about Catelyn Stark's letters to the Tullys and the Arryns, building her case, being intelligent, being wrong. The domestic threat, Jon said, the obvious one you mentioned. Tyrion went still in the way of someone who'd hoped to pass that part of the conversation quickly. I heard something, he said carefully. Before I left King's Landing, a conversation I wasn't meant to hear because people consistently underestimate how much a dwarf can hear from below the level of their attention. He looked at Jon. Someone in this castle has been writing south, not just to the Tullys, to King's Landing. Jon processed this. What kind of letters? The kind that describe your situation as a threat to the stability of the North and ask whether the Crown would be interested in providing resolution. Tyrion said the word with precision. Resolution, Jon repeated. Of the Jon Snow question, Tyrion said. He wasn't soft about it. He said it clean and let it sit. Jon was quiet for a moment. He felt the bond, Greysmoke outside in the yard, the slow breathing, the settled warmth, steady as a heartbeat. When you say resolution, Jon said. You mean someone suggested the king might want me dead? I mean someone suggested the king might not mind, Tyrion said. Which is different but achieves the same result. Jon nodded once. Not with surprise. With the recognition of something that had been a background awareness becoming a confirmed fact. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," Tyrion said, which was almost exactly what Arya had said. Jon noted this. They talked for another hour about the king's character, about Joffrey, about the layout of the approaching procession, and who was in it and what they wanted. Tyrion was, Jon discovered, exactly what his letter had suggested. Someone who had decided to be on the right side of this, not out of nobility, but out of self-interest and genuine intellectual delight. He liked dragons the way he liked books, as things that made the world more complicated and therefore more worth inhabiting. When Tyrion left, Jon stayed in the library for a while. He took out the Lannisters' letter and read it again, then fed it to the library's small hearth fire. Then he went to find Arya. She was in the stables, which was where she went when she was thinking. Not to ride, just to sit in the warmth and the animal smell and move through whatever she was working through in her own private way. Jon found her in Grey Wind's stall, Robb's direwolf between her and the wall, a knife she'd somehow acquired laid across her knee in the absent way of someone who'd been holding it for company rather than purpose. She looked up when he came in. She read his face immediately the way she always did. "How bad?" she said. Jon sat down across from her in the straw. Ghost padded in behind him and settled, and Grey Wind and Ghost exchanged the complicated silent communication of direwolves, which Jon had decided looked a lot like two people acknowledging each other across a room without needing to speak. He told her about Tyrion, about the letters, about who had been writing south and what they'd asked for. Arya's face went through several things and settled on something very still and very cold. She was 7 years old, and it was a cold that Jon recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror, and seeing it in hers made him feel both sorry and fiercely proud in the same breath. "I'll find out exactly what she sent," Arya said. "Arya, I move through this castle better than anyone," she said, simply and accurately. "Better than the servants, almost. Better than the guards. Nobody watches where I go." She looked at her knife. "I'll find out." Jon thought about telling her number. He thought about it and discarded it because telling Arya no was an invitation to do the thing more creatively, and also because she was right, and also because if someone had written letters asking for his death, then he needed to know precisely what those letters said. "Be careful," he said. "I'm always careful," she said. He looked at her. "I'm usually careful," she corrected. They sat together in the straw for a while, not talking. Ghost was asleep. Grey Wind was watching the stable entrance with his amber eyes, and the horses shifted and breathed, and outside the wind was picking up from the north, the kind of wind that had ice in it, the proper northern cold coming in for the season. "Jon," Arya said. "What?" "That Lannister." She had her thinking face on, the narrow-eyed one she used when she was sorting through something. "He's actually helping. I think so." "Why?" Jon thought about it. "Because he's been the wrong shape his whole life," he said. "And I'm the wrong kind of person in the wrong family, and I have a dragon that breaks every rule about what should exist. I think he looks at all of that and sees his people." Arya was quiet for a moment. "That's a generous read," she said. "Also," Jon said, "he hates his father and his father wants me dead, so there's a practical component." Arya nodded. "That's more Lannister," she said. "Both things can be true," Jon said. She leaned back against Grey Wind and looked at the stable roof. "Robb wants to talk to you," she said. "He's been wanting to for days, but he doesn't know how to start." "About the king coming." "About," she paused. "About what side of things he's going to be on, I think. He keeps looking at Mother and looking at you and looking uncomfortable." She glanced at him. "He's not going to choose her, Jon. I think he doesn't know that yet, but I know it." "Don't push him," Jon said. "Let him get there." "I'm not going to push him, I'm just telling you." She turned the knife in her fingers, the flat of it catching the lantern light. "We're your family, Jon, the real kind." Jon looked at her, 7 years old, lean and fierce and absolutely certain, sitting in a straw-smelling stable with a direwolf as her backrest. He thought about Greysmoke's warmth. He thought about the cold of the crypts where he'd spent name days and feast nights, and all the hours when being invisible was the only available option. "I know," he said, and meant it more than he had words for. He left her there and walked back through the castle under the stars, and Greysmoke heard him coming from 100 yards out and lifted his head from the eastern wall where he'd been watching the night. And Jon put his hand on the dragon's neck and felt the warmth, the deep pulse, the enormity of the bond. "Someone asked the king to kill me," he told the dragon. Greysmoke's pale eyes found him in the dark. The coal sound came, lower than usual, resonant. "I know," Jon said. "I'm not worried about it either." He looked up at the stars over Winterfell, sharp and cold and infinite. The kind of sky you only got in the north, where there was enough dark to really see them. And he thought about kings riding south, about letters with lion seals and letters that asked for resolutions, about a woman in a solar building cases in careful ink, and about himself, 10 years old, Aegon's blood, with a dragon under his hand and a wolf at his heel, and the north beginning to look at him and decide what it thought. Let them decide, he thought. Let them all decide. He wasn't hiding anymore. In the morning, Catelyn Stark came to the eastern yard while Jon was working with Greysmoke in the early gray light. She came alone, which surprised him. No septa, no handmaiden, no guard. Just herself, wrapped in a heavy cloak with her auburn hair braided against the wind, standing at the yard's edge with her hands clasped in front of her. Jon stopped working. He looked at her. Greysmoke turned his head. She looked at the dragon for a long time. Her face was doing its composure work, but underneath it something real was surfacing, something that had fought to stay managed for weeks and was losing the fight. Then she looked at Jon. "I want you to understand something," she said. Her voice was controlled, but only just. "Everything I have done, every letter I have written, every concern I have raised has been for my children, for Robb and Sansa and Arya and Bran and Rickon, for their safety." "I know," Jon said. "I am not your enemy," she said, and said it like she was making herself say it, like the words required effort. "With respect, my lady," Jon said, "you asked someone to have me killed." The silence that followed was extraordinary. The yard was empty except for the two of them and the dragon and the cold. And Catelyn Stark's face did something that Jon had never seen it do. It cracked, briefly, completely. The composure failing all at once like a wall hit in the right place. "I asked," she said carefully, "whether the crown might have an interest in resolving the question of a dragon in the north. I did not specify." "You knew what you were asking," Jon said, not cruelly, not with anger, just with the flat clarity that had become his natural register. She was quiet. She did not deny it. That, more than anything, told Jon something important about her. She was a woman who, when confronted with something true, did not lie. She maneuvered, she redirected, she built cases, but she did not lie directly. "What do you want?" she said finally. Jon looked at her. He thought about the many things he could say. He thought about the years of being invisible, of the seating at the lower table, of the specific quality of dismissal that had been his daily currency in this house. He thought about all of it, and he set it aside. "The same thing you want," he said. "A safe place for the people I love." He held her gaze. "We want the same things, Lady Stark. We just disagree about who those people are." Catelyn Stark looked at him for a long time. Greysmoke watched her, the pale eyes steady and patient and ancient. Then she left without another word, walking back across the yard with her cloak pulled against the wind, and Jon watched her go and thought, that's not an enemy convinced, but it might be an enemy made less certain. Sometimes that was enough. Greysmoke put his chin on Jon's shoulder, a gesture he'd developed recently, equal parts affection and possession. "Yes," Jon told him. "I know, King Robert in 2 weeks." The coal sound deep and comfortable. "No," Jon said, "you can't burn him, probably." Greysmoke sounded unconvinced. Chapter 5. What fire answers? Robert Baratheon arrived on a Thursday with 300 people, and the noise of a small city relocating itself northward. Jon heard them before he saw them, the horns first, carrying across the flat country south of Winterfell with the particular self-importance of royal processions. Then the sound of hooves, hundreds of them, churning the King's Road to mud despite the frost. He was on Greysmoke's back when they appeared on the southern horizon, a dark mass resolving slowly into banners and wagons and mounted knights, and the whole apparatus of a monarchy that had never learned to travel light. He stayed where he was, on the dragon's back above the castle gates, watching them come. He'd chosen this deliberately. Ned had suggested meeting the king in the courtyard, the traditional greeting, lord and household arrayed in welcome. Jon had listened to the suggestion and declined it, politely and finally, and Ned had looked at him for a moment and then nodded. Jon's position, above the gates on a dragon, visible from half a mile, was not accidental. It was the first thing Robert Baratheon would see when he arrived at Winterfell, and first things mattered. Greysmoke was absolutely still. He had a gift for stillness that Jon found remarkable in something his size, the ability to become architectural, to occupy space with the permanence of something that had always been there, and intended to remain. His wings were folded, his head up, his pale eyes fixed on the approaching procession with a calm that was also, unmistakably, a kind of judgment. Jon could feel the procession seeing them. The change in the column's sound, the slight disruption, the gap in conversation, the way a traveling group of 300 people absorbed a collective intake of breath and became briefly, utterly quiet. Then Robert Baratheon laughed. It carried that laugh. It was enormous and real, and had no performance in it. Just a man encountering something that delighted him against his will or his politics, or whatever he'd been planning to feel. Jon heard it from the gate and felt something relax in him. Not relief exactly, but an adjustment of the landscape. The king rode at the column's head on a destrier that was doing its best to be calm about the dragon and not quite managing it. Robert was huge. Not fat yet the way the histories would eventually make him, but big, barrel-chested, with a black beard and a presence that preceded him the way weather preceded a storm. He pulled his horse up at the gate and looked up at Jon on Greysmoke's back, and his face was doing something complicated, wonder and wariness and the ghost of an old grief moving through both, and then he said, loudly enough for half the yard to hear, "Ned, your bastard is sitting on a dragon." Ned Stark, standing in the yard below, said, "I see that, your grace." "Why didn't you tell me?" "I sent a raven," Ned said. "You sent a raven that said there has been a development in the north. That is not, Ned, that is the single greatest understatement in the history of the Seven Kingdoms." Robert looked back up at Jon. His eyes were bright and sharp under the bluff exterior, and Jon held the look without moving. "Well, come down, boy. Let me look at you." Jon considered this for a moment, and the moment was long enough that it registered, that it was a choice, not compliance, and then he said quietly to Greysmoke, and the dragon stepped off the battlements. 300 people reacted simultaneously. Horses shied. Someone screamed. 2 of the royal guard drew steel before their minds caught up with their hands. Robert's destrier went sideways, and Robert hauled it straight with a strength that was impressive, and an expression that was somewhere between terror and absolute joy. Greysmoke landed in the space before the gates with a sound like a door slamming in a very large house, snow swirling out from under his wings, and settled, and looked at Robert Baratheon. Robert looked back. His horse was still moving beneath him, tossing its head, but Robert himself was stone still, and in his face Jon could see the man beneath the king, the warrior he'd been, the boy even further under that, the person who'd grown up in a world where dragons were myth, and who was now looking at one from 40 feet. Jon dismounted from Greysmoke's shoulder, dropped to the ground and walked toward the king. He did not bow until he was close enough that the bow was a greeting rather than a submission, not the deep obeisance of a supplicant but the honest inclination of someone acknowledging rank while standing on their own ground. He straightened. "Your Grace," Jon said. Robert looked down at him from horseback. He was reading Jon the same way Jon was reading him, comprehensive, rapid, looking for the thing underneath the surface. Jon let him look. "How old are you?" Robert said. 10, Your Grace." 10. Robert said it like he was tasting something unexpected. "Ned, he looks like—" He stopped. Something moved across his face. "He looks like a Stark," he said, which was not what he'd started to say. "He does," Ned said, which was not a lie and was not the truth. Robert dismounted. He was even larger on the ground, a wall of a man, and he walked toward Greysmoke with the specific courage of someone who was afraid and was not going to let that stop him, which Jon respected enormously. Greysmoke watched him come. When Robert was within arm's reach, he stopped, and Greysmoke examined him with that slow, rotating attention, head tilting left, then right. "Does he bite?" Robert asked. "Not without reason," Jon said. "What counts as reason? He decides." Robert looked at the pale eyes up close, and something passed over his face. Wonder, grief. The complicated archaeology of a man confronting the living symbol of everything he'd spent 20 years defining himself against. Then he reached out one large hand and put it flat against Greysmoke's jaw. Greysmoke let him. Barely. He held the contact for 3 seconds and then moved his head away. Not threatening, just done, and Robert lowered his hand and turned back to Jon and said, "We need to talk. Tonight you, me, and Ned, no one else." "Yes, Your Grace," Jon said. Behind Robert, the procession was reorganizing itself, the disruption smoothing out as people processed what they'd seen and filed it away and got back to the business of arriving. Jon scanned the column. Queensguard in white and gold, household knights, wagons, servants, and there, near the back of the forward group on a gray horse, a boy about his own age in expensive clothes, watching Jon with an expression that had several things in it and none of them were good. Joffrey Baratheon, golden-haired, beautiful in the way of things that looked better than they were, with his mother Cersei's cheekbones and something behind his eyes that Tyrion had tried to describe, and that Jon could now see for himself. The boy was watching Greysmoke with want and watching Jon with something that was not quite hatred, but was the precursor to it. The resentment of someone who'd expected to be the most important thing in any room, and had arrived to find the room already occupied. Jon noted him. Set him aside for now. Tyrion, somewhere in the procession, caught Jon's eye and raised his wine cup in a brief, ironic salute. The banquet that night was the largest thing Winterfell had hosted in years. The great hall was full, Robert's household interlocked with the Stark household, and the Mormont visitors in a complicated social weave that Catelyn managed with the focused precision of someone disarming a mechanism. She was extraordinary at it, Jon thought. Whatever else was true about her, she could run a feast the way a general ran a field. Jon sat lower than he wanted and higher than he'd ever been allowed before, which was its own kind of commentary on how things had shifted. Tyrion was across the table and 3 seats down, drinking steadily and watching everything with those mismatched eyes. Lyanna Mormont was beside Jon, eating with the focused efficiency of someone who treated meals as fuel rather than entertainment, making occasional terse observations about the food or the people around them that Jon found consistently more accurate than most full conversations he had with adults. "The Queen hates your dragon," Lyanna said, at one point quietly. Jon looked down the table. Cersei Lannister was at Robert's right hand, beautiful and composed and radiating the specific kind of displeasure that never quite surfaced fully, staying always just below the level where anyone could call it out. She was looking at the space above Jon's head as though Greysmoke, who was outside but present in the way Greysmoke was always present at the edges of Jon's awareness, was a person she was being asked to share a room with and was deciding against. She hates a lot of things, Jon said. You specifically, though, Lyanna said. She's looked at you 6 times in the last hour, not at the dragon, at you. Jon filed this. Tyrion's right, Lyanna said, which told Jon that those two had spoken, and that Lyanna had decided what she thought of the Lannister dwarf with her characteristic efficiency. Someone in this room wants you dead. She said it the way she said most things, a fact to be addressed. I've told Dacey and the guards we're watching. Jon looked at her. You don't have to, don't, she said. I shook your hand. Bear Island keeps its word. She picked up a piece of bread and ate it. Also, you have a dragon. Protecting you is the smartest investment Bear Island has made in a generation. Jon almost smiled. That's very honest. It's both, she said, with a slight edge that told him she meant the first reason as much as the second, and didn't want him to miss that. Across the hall, Joffrey Baratheon was talking to Sansa, and Sansa was looking at him with the dazzled expression of a girl who'd been told all her life that the best outcome was a great match, and had just encountered what a great match looked like from the outside. Jon watched this with a particular feeling he couldn't quite name, something protective and worried, and made a mental note. Robert, at the head of the table, was drinking and laughing and telling a story that involved him doing something impressive in a battle 20 years ago, and he was genuinely compelling at it. The story had shape and humor and the kind of easy authority that came from being the most powerful person in the room for long enough that it stopped being a performance. Jon watched him and thought, this is the man who has to be managed. Not defeated, not circumvented. Managed. Because Robert Baratheon was not his enemy if the framing stayed right, and the framing was Jon's to control. After the feast, Robert did what he'd promised. He sent everyone away, his own household, Cersei included, though she left with the quality of cold she reserved for being dismissed by her husband, which was a cold with architecture to it, and sat with Ned and Jon in the smaller solar off the great hall, a fire going, 3 cups on the table, 2 of them with wine. Robert looked at Jon for a long time. In the firelight and the quiet, without the performance of a rival, he looked older and more tired and more real. Tell me about the dragon, he said. Everything start from the beginning, so Jon told him. He watched Robert's face while he spoke, the king's expression cycling through the story like weather, interest and surprise and the grief Jon had noticed earlier, surfacing and submerging. When Jon finished, Robert was quiet, turning his cup in his hands. In the crypts, Robert said, a stark dragon egg. There are accounts, Ned said carefully, of Valyrian gifts early in the... I know the accounts. Robert looked at Ned. I grew up in the Vale. Maester Coleman made me read everything, and I retained considerably more than he expected. He looked back at Jon. You know what dragons mean, boy, in terms of... He gestured vaguely at the world. Power, Jon said. Power, Robert agreed. And who it belongs to and who decides, he leaned forward. I have spent 20 years building a kingdom that runs on the idea that the Targaryens are gone and what they represented is gone with them. No dragons, no magic, no, he stopped. And now there's a dragon in the north, bonded to a stark bastard. He looked at Jon, and Jon held the look. What do I do with that? Nothing, Jon said. Robert blinked. Greysmoke is mine, Jon said. He hatched in your ally's castle for your ally's son. That's not a threat to your kingdom, your grace. That's an asset to it if you're sensible about it. He held Robert's gaze. The threat is what happens if you try to change that. The fire cracked. The silence was Robert processing something. That is, Robert said slowly, a remarkably bold thing to say to a king. You asked a direct question, Jon said. You deserved a direct answer. Robert looked at Ned. Ned's face was doing its composed thing, which was its own kind of speaking. Robert looked back at Jon, and the ghost of a smile moved across his face. the smile of a man who had been flattered and managed and positioned around for 20 years and had just encountered something that wasn't doing any of those things. "Ned," Robert said, "I like your bastard." "He grows on you," Ned said. "How much control do you have over the dragon?" Robert asked Jon. "Real control." "He's not a weapon," Jon said. "He doesn't take orders. We understand each other." "That's not the same thing." "No," Jon said. "It's better." Robert was quiet again. He drank. He looked at the fire. "There are people in my court," he said, "who are going to have opinions about this. Strong opinions. Opinions that involve words like threat and precedent and Targaryen." He said the last word carefully, watching Jon. Jon watched him back, did not flinch. "I'll handle my court," Robert said finally, in a tone that closed the subject. "You stay out of things that aren't your business and keep that dragon from burning my people, and He stopped. "We'll see." It was not everything Jon wanted. It was considerably more than he'd feared. He nodded. "There is one more thing." Robert's voice had changed, dropped in register. He looked at Ned, and between them passed the kind of communication that 20 years of deep friendship produced, the kind that had whole conversations in a glance. "There are people in my procession," Robert said carefully, "who may have ideas about simplifying this situation. I want you to know that those ideas are not mine." He looked at Jon directly. "I want you to hear me say that clearly." "I hear you, Your Grace," Jon said. "Good." Robert stood, refilling his cup. The conversation was over, or the formal part of it was. He looked at Jon one more time with that complex expression, wonder and grief and old history, and Jon thought, he knows, not the specifics, but something in him knows the shape of it. "Get some sleep, boy. Tomorrow I want to see the dragon fly." The attempt came 3 days into the royal visit. On a gray morning, while most of the castle was still finding its feet, Jon knew it was coming the way he'd known most things since Greysmoke hatched, not precisely, not with specific information, but with the bone-deep situational awareness that had become his new normal. He'd been sleeping lightly. Greysmoke had been restless 2 nights running, which the dragon only was when Jon's own sleeping mind was working through something urgent. Arya had come to him the previous evening with what she'd found. She'd gotten into Catelyn's solar. Jon didn't ask how, and the slight scratches on her fingers suggested the window latch had been the solution, and she'd found a letter. Not the letters to the Tullys or the Arryns, but a newer one, received rather than sent, and the seal had been broken and resealed clumsily. The letter was from someone in King's Landing. It contained instructions. It named a man. Sir Donald Drum, a household knight in the royal procession, attached to no specific lord but present in the way of men who existed in the margins of courts, useful for tasks that required no signature. The letter said that the resolution of the northern situation would be worth 20,000 gold dragons to whoever arranged it cleanly and without implication reaching upward. It did not use his name. It called him the bastard. Jon had read it twice and handed it back to Arya and said, "Burn it." Arya had looked at it and then at him. "Shouldn't you keep it? Evidence." "Evidence of what? Presented to whom?" Jon said. "The king says it isn't him. I believe him. The letter doesn't name who hired Drum. All it does is tell me there's a man named Drum in the castle who's planning to kill me, and I already knew that. Now you know it. Luwin will not know it. Ned will not know it." He looked at her. "Burn it." She burned it. He'd told Jory, quietly, that he'd heard Sir Donald Drum had a reputation for dishonest play, and that Jory might want to know where Drum was at any given time over the next few days. Jory had asked no questions and gone to work. He'd told Lyanna, who had told Dacey, and Bear Island's people had positioned themselves without being asked to position themselves. He'd told Greysmoke nothing, because Greysmoke already knew. So on the gray morning, when Jon was in the eastern yard working through sword forms alone and the yard was empty except for him, he was not surprised when he heard the footsteps in the passage beside the stables. 2 sets, not 1. which was the detail that mattered. He'd expected one man and there were two, which meant Drum had a partner, which meant either the 20,000 gold dragons was being split or someone else in the castle had their own reasons. Jon kept working through the forms. He did not change his pace. He did not look at the passage entrance. Greysmoke, on the eastern wall above him, had been still for the past 10 minutes. He was still now. But the stillness had changed quality. It was no longer the restful stillness of a dragon watching the morning. It was the stillness of something that has identified a target and is waiting. The two men came through the passage entrance and into the yard. Jon heard them stop. He turned around. Sir Donald Drum was medium height, forgettable featured with the build of a man who stayed in condition without being conspicuous about it. His companion was younger, heavyset, with the look of someone hired for muscle rather than skill. Neither of them had their swords drawn yet, which told Jon they thought they could manage this cleanly, quietly, close work, no noise. "Jon Snow," Drum said. His voice was professional. "Walk with me." "No," Jon said. Drum looked at him, processing the single syllable, reevaluating. His eyes moved to the wall above, to Greysmoke, who was looking down at them both with those pale silver eyes, and moved back to Jon with a recalibration that was visible and not fast enough. "The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch is looking for recruits," Drum said pleasantly. "We thought we'd offer you the opportunity to volunteer." "That's not what you thought," Jon said. The heavy-set man moved first. He had a blackjack, a weighted leather sap, and he knew how to use it, moving with practiced efficiency toward Jon's blind side. Greysmoke came off the wall. He didn't fly, there wasn't room or time for that. He simply stepped off the parapet in a controlled drop that covered 40 feet in less than 2 seconds, landed between Jon and the heavyset man with a sound like a siege engine meeting a wall, and the impact threw the man off his feet and back into the stable wall 12 feet away, where he hit with a sound that ended the fight's second participant before it properly started. Drum drew his sword. Jon drew his. They stood in the yard, 10 feet apart, and Jon looked at the knight across the steel and thought, "This is someone else's tool. Not evil, not personal, just expensive and professional and pointed in the wrong direction." Drum was good. Jon knew it from how he stood, the balance, the grip, the way his eyes tracked without his head moving. This was not a man who intended to lose to a 10-year-old boy in a castle yard. Jon moved first. He'd spent 2 years being deliberately careful in the training yard, taking pains to be good without being exceptional, keeping his real capability behind a wall of tactical modesty. That was done. He went directly, no feint, driving hard into Drum's guard with a speed that the knight clearly hadn't expected from someone his age, and the first exchange was Jon's. He got inside the reach, forced Drum to step back and reset. Drum adjusted. He was fast, professionally fast, and he came back with a combination that would have worked against most opponents. Jon wasn't most opponents. He'd been trained by Sir Roderick and by watching every sparring session in the yard for 2 years, and by reading everything about swordwork in Lewin's library, because books were the only teachers who didn't modify their instruction based on his name. He slipped the combination, turned Drum's blade, and hit him in the jaw with the pommel of his sword hard enough to make the knight's eyes go wrong. Drum stumbled, caught himself. His sword came up again, slower. Greysmoke made a sound. It was not the coal sound. It was not the high flying joy sound. It was something Jon had never heard before, lower and larger than both, a sound with mass and heat in it, a sound that arrived in the chest before it arrived in the ears, and with it came a wave of warmth from the dragon's direction that was tangible even across 15 feet of cold yard air. Drum looked at Greysmoke. The dragon opened his mouth. The fire came out in a stream that was nothing like the experimental short bursts of the previous weeks. This was full and real and sustained, a column of orange-white fire that lasted 4 full seconds and hit the yard's stone wall at chest height, 10 feet to Drum's right, close enough that the heat was instant, and the stone glowed and the snow within 20 feet turned instantly to steam. Drum dropped his sword. He dropped it and put both hands up and stood very still, because he was a professional and professionals understood when situations had moved past their capacity for management. The stone was still glowing, the orange cooling to red in the cold air. Steam drifted. The smell of the fire, dry and hot and ancient, nothing like ordinary fire, filled the yard. Jon looked at the night. He did not feel the surge of triumph he might have expected. He felt very clear, very calm, the same quality of clarity he felt when the bond was open and Greysmoke was flying and everything was exactly what it should be. "Tell me who hired you," Jon said. "I'll die before." "You'll die either way," Jon said, not threatening, informational. "Greysmoke doesn't particularly distinguish between people who threaten me and people who sent them. I do. Tell me who hired you, and I'll give you the choice of how you leave this castle." Drum looked at the dragon. Greysmoke was watching him with those pale eyes, and the yard still smelled of fire, and the stone wall still radiated heat, and the heavy-set man in the corner was not moving. "Lannister," Drum said. "A Lannister agent. I don't have the name. I was given a letter through an intermediary. I don't know which Lannister." Jon believed him. "Jory," he said. "Jory Castle came through the yard gate with 2 of his men, which meant he'd been at the gate the whole time, which meant he'd been watching." Jon noted this without surprise. Jory was good at his job, and good at his job meant knowing when to wait and when to move. "Take him," Jon said. "Keep him separate from the other one. Tell Lord Stark." "And the other one?" Jory asked, looking at the heavy-set man. "He'll need a maester," Jon said. Jory nodded and moved, and his men moved, and the yard was suddenly full of the efficient motion of a situation being processed. Jon sheathed his sword. He turned to Greysmoke, and the dragon lowered his head, and Jon put his hands on either side of the dragon's jaw, feeling the warmth, the pulse, the specific quality of Greysmoke's attention, which was always primarily Jon. "That was for me," Jon said. Greysmoke made a sound. "I know," Jon said. "I know you were waiting." He looked at the scorch mark on the wall, black on gray stone, permanent, a record. He thought about what Tyrion had said. Someone in the procession is carrying instructions. He thought about the letter Arya had burned. He thought about the word resolution. He turned and walked inside to find Ned. Ned's response to the full account was a long silence followed by a controlled fury that was more frightening than shouting would have been. The quiet, thorough anger of a man who kept his emotions behind stone and was finding the stone inadequate. He listened without interrupting, standing at his solar window, and when Jon finished he said, "I'll go to Robert. He'll deny any connection. Robert didn't hire this man. I know Robert." "I know," Jon said, "but someone who serves a Lannister did, and the Queen is a Lannister." He let that sit. "What happens when you take this to Robert is that you force him to choose between his wife and his friend's son, and kings don't like being forced to choose things. The framing matters." Ned looked at him. "Tell him," Jon said, "that someone tried to harm his host's family member while under guest right in his host's castle. Don't name Lannister. Let him get there." He paused. "Guest right means something to Robert. He's old enough to remember what happened to people who broke it." Ned was quiet for a moment. "When did you become a politician?" "I've been paying attention," Jon said. Ned almost smiled. Almost. He composed it back. "Are you hurt?" "Number the man Drum is secured. Jory has him." Jon moved to the door. "I'll be in the yard. Tell me what Robert says." He was halfway down the corridor when Ned said, "Jon," he stopped. "What you did today," Ned's voice had something in it that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite grief and was, as usual, some region between the two. "You handled yourself well." Jon turned enough to see his father's face. Ned Stark, Lord of Winterfell, was looking at him with that expression, the one with all the layers of debt in it, and Jon held the look for a moment and then said, "I know," and walked on. He found Arya in the yard already, sitting on Greysmoke's tail. The dragon had allowed this with the same resigned acceptance he showed toward most of Arya's innovations, watching the scorch mark on the wall with the expression of someone appraising work. "Clean," she said when Jon came to stand beside her. "Too much," Jon said. He was already surrendering. "The wall, I meant," Arya said. "Clean line, controlled." She looked at Greysmoke. He was aiming wide on purpose. Jon looked at the mark. She was right. Drum had been 10 feet from the fire's impact point. For Greysmoke at this range, that gap was not imprecision. "He was making a point," Jon said. "What point?" Jon looked at the glowing stone, still hot, the record of it permanent and black. He thought about the yard and the castle and the king inside it, and the procession that had brought 300 people into Winterfell with all their needs and plans and instructions. "That he could have," Jon said. Arya looked at the wall for another moment. "That's a good point," she said. Lyanna arrived at a controlled jog that she immediately slowed to a walk when she saw the scene was resolved, preserving dignity. She looked at the wall, at Drum's dropped sword still on the ground, at the absence of 2 men who'd apparently been carried out. She looked at Jon. "I missed it," she said, with the specific displeasure of someone who'd been positioned and had still missed the action. "You were watching the gate," Jon said. "That was your job." "It was boring," she said. "Good," Jon said. "Boring means you did it right." She considered this. "Fair," she said, and sat down next to Arya on Greysmoke's tail, which made the dragon turn his head and look at both of them with the expression of something reconsidering the boundaries it had set. Jon laughed. He hadn't expected it. It just came. And in the cold yard with the scorch mark and the 2 fierce girls on his dragon's tail and Greysmoke's profound offended dignity, he stood and laughed until his chest ached with it. Greysmoke made a sound that was somehow both aggrieved and fond. Robert came to find Jon himself, an hour later. No entourage, no ceremony, just the king of the 7 kingdoms walking through Winterfell's eastern yard in a heavy cloak with his hands clasped behind his back, alone. He stood in front of the scorch mark for a long time. "Ned told me," he said, "about the man." "Drum," Jon said. "He's been escorted out of the procession. He'll be dealt with." Robert said it with the flat authority of someone closing a door. "I want you to know that He stopped. He turned from the wall to look at Jon. "I don't use hired men in guest castles. I don't operate that way." "I believe you," Jon said, "but you know who did." Robert said it carefully, not a question. "I have a suspicion," Jon said. "I don't have proof." Robert looked at him. The king's face was doing the complicated thing it did sometimes, the archaeology of old decisions and their costs. "My wife," he said, very flat. Jon said nothing. "Or her father," Robert said, "which amounts to the same thing." He ran a hand through his beard. "There are things about my marriage, boy, that are—" He stopped, started again. "Tywin Lannister has been the hand that holds the realm for 20 years. I have spent 20 years pretending I didn't know that." He looked at Jon directly. "I'm telling you this because you're smarter than you should be at your age, and because I think you already know it, and because—" He stopped again, and what stopped him seemed to be something private and unresolved. "Because I looked at you when you came through those gates on that dragon, and I thought, that's what it looks like, when someone has the right to the space they're standing in." He said it gruffly, uncomfortable with his own sentiment. "Ned kept you hidden too long." Jon absorbed this. "He kept me safe," he said, "because it was true and because Robert didn't need to feel worse about Ned Stark than he already did." Robert nodded. "Your dragon," he said. "Greysmoke." He tested the name. "He'll grow larger, much larger. How loyal is he to you specifically?" "Entirely," Jon said. "And if something happened to you," Jon looked at the scorch mark, "then I'd say the relevant question is what he'd be loyal to after that." He met Robert's eyes. "But nothing's going to happen to me." Robert looked at him for a moment, then he said, "Number, I don't think it is." He turned to go, stopped. Come to the hall tonight, not at the end of the table, beside Ned. It was an instruction with a statement embedded in it, the statement being, I'm making this public, I'm adjusting the position you hold in this. Bring the damn dragon if you can fit him through the doors. He won't fit, Jon said. Have him sit outside a window then, I want to be able to see him while I eat. Robert walked away across the yard. And stop calling me your grace every time, Robert, when it's like this. Jon watched the king leave. He felt Greysmoke at his back, the warmth, the presence, the steady deep pulse that had become so foundational to his existence that its absence would have been like losing a heartbeat. He thought about tonight, about the table and the position and Robert's public adjustment of it. He thought about Cersei Lannister watching from her seat and calculating and recalculating. He thought about Tyrion, who would watch all of it with his mismatched eyes and his wine and his sharp, quiet intelligence. He thought about Catelyn Stark, who would manage the feast with her usual precision, and was discovering, day by day, that precision had its limits. He thought about Ned, who had kept a secret for 11 years and was about to have to reckon with what it meant that the secret had grown into a dragon. One more thing to navigate, he told Greysmoke. The coals sound, warm and certain. Yes, Jon said. I know we can. The yard was cold and clear, the scorch mark black against gray stone, and the sky above Winterfell was wide and full of the sharp winter light that the north did better than anywhere, the light that had no warmth but had honesty, showing everything exactly as it was. Jon Snow stood in it without flinching. Chapter 6. The name he was born with 3 days after the assassination attempt, Winterfell had a particular stillness to it. Not the stillness of peace. The castle was fuller than it had been in years. 300 royal guests layered over the household, the kitchens running without pause, the yards busy with knights and servants, and the constant low-level friction of too many people from too many places trying to share limited space. But underneath all that motion, there was a stillness. The way a river goes quiet before a falls. The way a conversation pauses before the sentence that changes everything. Jon felt it. He'd been feeling it since his conversation with Robert in the yard, since the king had said beside Ned and walked away like the thing was done, which it was, because Robert Baratheon was the kind of man whose words arranged the world rather than described it. That night's feast had been exactly what Robert intended. Jon at Ned's side, the Mormonts flanking him, Tyrion across the table with his wine and his sharp, quiet attention, and Robert at the head of it, all looking genuinely pleased with himself in the way of a man who believed he'd solved a problem when he'd actually only moved it. Cersei had sat through the entire feast with her chin up and her eyes doing the work her face wouldn't permit, and Jon had watched her watching him and thought, she is the most dangerous person at this table. Not because she was cruel, though she could be, because she was intelligent and patient and operating on a timeline that extended past any single dinner or political adjustment, and she had not yet played her full hand. He was still thinking about this when Ned found him on the 4th morning. Jon was on the battlements, the high eastern wall where Greysmoke liked to sleep in the early hours. The dragon curled behind him like a warm wall against the wind. Ghost was somewhere below. Jon could feel the wolf's presence in the vague peripheral way of the direwolf bond, which was different from the Greysmoke bond the way weather was different from standing in front of a fire. The sky was iron gray, heavy with cloud moving down from the north, and the cold had teeth. Ned came up the stairs alone. He was wearing his heavy cloak and carrying nothing, which meant this wasn't a lord visiting his son about castle business. This was a father who had finally stepped off the ledge. Jon had been waiting for it since their conversation in the solar. He'd known, with the same bone certainty that told him when the yard was dangerous, that Ned had more to say and was building toward it, assembling the courage or the words or both. He'd let the man assemble. He'd been patient. Now Ned came to stand beside him at the battlement wall and looked out at the gray country and the dark line of the Wolfswood and the Kingsroad running south, and for a while neither of them spoke. I told you her name, Ned said. Lyanna. Yes. I told you about Rhaegar. A pause. I told you your name. Aegon, Jon said quietly. The name still did the thing it did, the key and lock, the recognition. He'd been living with it for days now, and it still arrived with weight each time. There's more, Ned said. Jon waited. Ned looked at the horizon. His jaw was working slightly, the way it did when he was managing something internal. I need you to understand, he said, that everything I've done, the name, the silence, the lie I've lived for 11 years was to protect you, not just from Robert, from all of it. From what your existence means in a world that spent a war deciding what to do with Targaryens. I understand that, Jon said. I need you to hear it as something other than an excuse, Ned said, which was honest and difficult and exactly the right thing to say, because it was both. It was protection and it was cowardice, and I have never been certain where one ended and the other began. Jon looked at his father, the man who'd given him a name that wasn't his and a house that was half his and a love that was complete even when the circumstances of it weren't. He felt the complicated weight of it without resentment. Resentment would have been easier in some ways. What he actually felt was harder to carry and more honest. Tell me the rest, Jon said. Ned turned from the horizon. He looked at his son with those gray, stark eyes, and in them Jon could see Lyanna, not clearly, not like a mirror, but the ghost of her, the shape of her presence in his father's grief. Your mother, Ned said. She was the best of us. Braver than me by a considerable margin, which I know sounds like a strange thing to say about a woman who died young in a tower in Dorne. But brave isn't about outcome. He stopped. She loved Rhaegar. I know that's not, I know what Robert believed, what the histories say, but I was there. I saw them together once before the war. She loved him, and I think he loved her, and what they made was, he looked at Jon. Was you, among other things. Other things, Jon said carefully. Rhaegar had a first wife, Ned said. Elia Martell, children by her Aegon Rhaenys. They were killed during the sack of King's Landing, by the Mountain on Tywin Lannister's orders. His voice was flat and precise, reporting history. So when your mother named you Aegon, she was naming you for your half-brother, the boy who should have been king, who never got to be, and for the conqueror who shares the name, and because, he paused, because she knew she was dying. She knew what she was leaving you with. Jon absorbed this quietly. Half-siblings dead before he was born, a name that was both inheritance and memorial. The weight of it settled on him not as burden but as clarity, more of the picture filling in, the outline of what he actually was becoming more defined. The Targaryen claim, Jon said. Yes. Through Rhaegar I'm ahead of Daenerys Targaryen in the succession, if we're counting succession. He said it analytically, the way you discuss a mathematical problem. Ned looked at him. You've been thinking about this. Tyrion's been helping me think about it, Jon said, which was not quite accurate. Tyrion had been probing the edges of the topic with the careful indirection of a man testing ice, and Jon had been drawing conclusions from the probe rather than from anything said directly. He hasn't said it outright, but he said enough. Ned looked at the horizon again. The wind was picking up, pulling at his cloak. Jon, he said, what I need you to understand about the claim, about what your blood means, is that it is also the most dangerous thing about you. More dangerous than the dragon. The dragon is extraordinary. Your parentage is a war. I know, Jon said. Robert suspects something, Jon said. I've watched him watching me. He doesn't have the specifics, but he has the feeling, and he's a man who trusts his feelings. He looked at his father. He's chosen not to pursue it. That choice was deliberate, and it was his gift to you, or to me, or to both of us. I don't intend to waste it. Ned looked at him for a long moment. What do you intend? Jon turned from the wall and looked north, away from the King's Road and the royal procession's banners and all of it, north toward the country that was the only country he'd ever known, the gray and brown and white of it, the hard beauty of it, the forests and the moors and the far white mountains. I intend to be here, Jon said. The North is mine. Not by your lordship or by succession documents or by anyone's permission. It's mine because Greysmoke hatched here, because the first thing he ate was the bone of old kings, because every house from Bear Island to Last Hearth is already deciding what it thinks about me." He paused. "The South can have its games. The Iron Throne can have its players. I'm not interested in it." "Jon, not yet," Jon said. He said it with a precision that was itself a kind of claim. Not yet was not never. "There are things north of the wall that you and I both know are more real than succession disputes. I've read the Night's Watch reports that Luwin keeps in the archive. The ones that come from Rangers. The ones that describe things that shouldn't exist." He looked at his father. "When that becomes the problem, which it will, and I think sooner than the South believes, I want to be ready. I want the North to be ready." He held Ned's gaze. "That's what Greysmoke is for." Ned Stark looked at his sister's son for a long time. The wind moved between them. Behind Jon, Greysmoke lifted his head without being prompted, and the pale eyes opened and found Ned. And in the dragon's gaze was something that Jon had come to understand as the dragon's way of underscoring something Jon had said, agreeing with it in the only language available to something that didn't use words. "I know," Ned said, very quietly. "I know what's north of the wall." "Then we agree," Jon said. A long silence. Then Ned did something Jon had not expected. He reached out and put his hand on Jon's shoulder, and the grip was firm and real and had all the years of inadequate love trying to become adequate in it, and Jon let himself feel it without deflecting it away. "Egon," Ned said. The name in his mouth was different from how Jon heard it in his own head. It had grief in it, Lyanna-shaped grief, but also something new. Acknowledgement. Witness. "I see you. I know who you are." "What do you want to do about the name?" Jon thought about it. He looked at the gray sky and felt the dragon's warmth at his back and the wolf's presence below and the castle's old stones under his feet, stones that had heard his footsteps since he was small enough that they made no sound. "Jon," he said, "for now." He met his father's eyes. "Jon Stark." Ned's grip on his shoulder tightened, just briefly. "Your mother would have liked you," he said. "She'd have liked Greysmoke more," Jon said. Ned laughed, a real laugh, short and sudden, the kind he rarely produced and that transformed his face when it came. Jon smiled. He found Tyrion in the library, which was where Tyrion went when he'd exhausted every other option for entertainment, reading 2 books simultaneously in the methodical way of someone who treated knowledge acquisition as a competitive sport. Tyrion looked up when Jon came in and closed the door. He read Jon's face the way he read most things, quickly and completely, and set both books down. "He told you," Tyrion said. "Everything," Jon said. Tyrion was quiet for a moment. "Then how do you feel?" "Clear," Jon said. He sat across from the Lannister. "I want to know what you know, not hints and probes, actually know." Tyrion looked at him. The mismatched eyes did their calculation. "How specific are we talking?" "Daenerys Targaryen," Jon said. "Where is she?" Tyrion blinked. Then he settled back in his chair with the expression of a man who'd been playing a careful game and has just had his opponent flip the table over and start a different one. "Across the narrow sea," he said. "Last confirmed reports placed her in Essos, moving between the free cities. She had dragons, 3 of them hatched at the Dothraki Sea. There are accounts." He watched Jon's face. "You've thought about this?" "I've thought about what 3 dragons means," Jon said, "and what 1 dragon and 1 dragon's rider means in comparison." "It means you're behind," Tyrion said frankly. "In terms of raw scale, 3 dragons against 1, regardless of the individual dragon's size or capability, is a numbers problem." He paused. "Unless the individual dragon is significantly larger and his rider is." He stopped. "What exactly are you planning?" "Nothing yet," Jon said. "I want to understand the full board before I decide where to move." He looked at Tyrion directly. "You're a Lannister. Regrettably. Your family wants me dead." "My father wants you dead," Tyrion said precisely. "My sister wants you dead because you're a complication. I want you alive because you're the most interesting thing that's happened in Westeros since. He gestured. Ever possibly, he leaned forward. And because, if I'm honest, and I am making a policy of honesty with you because I think it's the only viable currency, if I'm honest, I have spent my entire life in a family that treats people as tools, and I find I am very tired of it. You are not my father's tool. That alone makes you worth knowing. Jon regarded him. I'm going to need someone who understands King's Landing, he said. The court, how it works, how to work it. You're asking me. I'm not asking anything, Jon said. I'm telling you what I need, and I'm letting you decide whether you want to be useful or not. He held Tyrion's gaze. I'm 10 years old and I have a dragon and the blood of two of the oldest families in Westeros's history. And if what comes from north of the wall is what I think it is, the political games everyone is playing right now are going to look very small very soon. I need people around me who can see the bigger picture. Tyrion looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his wine cup, which was empty, looked at it mournfully, and set it back down. Well, he said, the wall can certainly wait. The morning before the royal procession was due to depart. Joffrey Baratheon finally did what Jon had been waiting for him to do. He came to the eastern yard with two of his household attendants, boys his own age, positioned as companions but functioning as audience, and he found Jon working Greysmoke through a series of movements that Jon had been developing over the past weeks. Not commands exactly, but a vocabulary. A shared language of weight and direction and intention that let them coordinate in the yard the way they coordinated in the air. Greysmoke moved with the focused pleasure of something doing what it was built to do, and Jon moved with him, and the whole thing had the quality of a dance that both partners had choreographed simultaneously and independently. Joffrey watched from the yard entrance for a while. Jon was aware of him, had been aware of him the moment he appeared, the way Greysmoke's attention shifted fractionally to include the new presence, cataloging it. You there, Joffrey said. The bastard. Jon stopped working. He turned around, unhurried. Joffrey was handsome in the way of things that had been given everything they needed to be handsome and had never developed anything beyond it. He was dressed well, carrying a short sword at his hip that had the look of something expensive and ceremonial, and his face had the expression Jon had seen from across the feast hall, the resentment of someone arriving late to importance. Jon said. Joffrey blinked. What? My name, Jon said. Not the bastard, Jon. He said it without edge, without aggression, with the flat simplicity of correcting a factual error. One of Joffrey's attendants made a sound. Joffrey's eyes flickered to the sound and back to Jon, and the resentment sharpened into something more specific. I want to ride the dragon, Joffrey said. Greysmoke turned his head toward the prince. The pale eyes fixed on him with the particular quality of attention that Jon had come to recognize, the assessment attention, the rapid and thorough evaluation. No, Jon said. I'm the prince. I know who you are, Jon said. The answer is still number. Joffrey's jaw tightened. He was 10 years old and had been navigating a world that rearranged itself around his comfort since before he could form sentences, and the single syllable arrived like something that didn't fit the shape of his experience and was therefore, on some level, incomprehensible. My father is the king, he said, in case Jon had somehow missed this. Your father is the king, Jon agreed. He doesn't ride Greysmoke either. I could have you. What? Jon said. The word stopped Joffrey. Not because it was loud, it wasn't, but because of what was in it. An invitation. Finish the sentence. Say the thing. See what happens after that. Jon stood in the yard with his dragon at his back and looked at the prince with the patience of someone who had all the time available and no particular emotional investment in the outcome. Joffrey looked at Greysmoke. The dragon had moved slightly, without apparent purpose, and was now standing with his head above and behind Jon's left shoulder, not threatening, just present, his pale eyes on Joffrey with that slow, unblinking attention. The prince looked back at Jon. Something in his face shifted, not humility, that wasn't in the vocabulary, but the recognition of a landscape that didn't operate on the rules he knew. He opened his mouth. Greysmoke decides who rides him, Jon said before Joffrey could say whatever he was going to say. He kept his voice level and even gave it a slight softening, not conciliatory but pragmatic, the tone of someone explaining something operational. Not me, not your father, not anyone, he decides. He paused. If you want to stand near him, I'll ask him if he's willing. That's what I can offer. Joffrey looked at the dragon. Something moved in the prince's face that was, underneath all the expectation and resentment and inherited arrogance, genuinely young, the 10-year-old that the prince also was, encountering something that exceeded his experience of the world. Would he? I don't know, Jon said honestly. He decides. A long moment. Then Joffrey took 2 steps forward, stopped, waited. Greysmoke looked at him for a full count of 10, his head tilted. Then he looked away back at the yard's far wall, dismissing the prince with the absolute finality of something that has completed its assessment and found the result uninteresting. Jon said nothing. He didn't soften it or explain it away. He just let it be what it was. Joffrey stood in the yard for a moment that must have felt very long, and then he turned and walked back the way he'd come, and his attendants fell in behind him. And Jon watched him go and felt something that was not quite pity and not quite satisfaction, something more complicated than either, the feeling of watching someone encounter the world's refusal to rearrange itself, and not yet knowing what to do with the encounter. One of the attendants looked back over his shoulder. Jon held the look until the boy turned away. Greysmoke made the coal sound. You could have been nicer, Jon said. The pale eyes found him. The coal sound again, carrying its specific quality of self-satisfied certainty. He is going to be a problem, Jon said. Later, when he has more power. The coal sound said, we'll manage it. We'll manage it, Jon agreed. That afternoon the northern lords arrived. Not all of them, not a formal gathering, nothing that official, but the ravens that had been flying for weeks had clearly been answered with riding. And between the royal procession's presence and the news that had spread from Bear Island to the Dreadfort to the Mountains of the Moon, several houses had sent representatives. Lord Greatjon Umber came himself, which Jon could tell from the sound of him before he came through the gates, a voice like a battering ram operated by someone having a good time. Rickard Karstark arrived with 2 sons and an expression of deep evaluation. Galbart Glover came quiet and watchful, with the sharp eyes of a man who had been managing border threats long enough to know what real power looked like, and was checking whether this qualified. Ned held an informal meeting in the Great Hall that afternoon that was not a formal assembly but functioned as one. The way things in the North often worked, without ceremony but with weight, the weight of men who said fewer words and meant all of them. Jon stood beside his father, not behind him, beside him. He did not speak first. He listened while Ned addressed the room, the basics, the hatching, the situation with the king's visit, the political landscape. He listened and watched and felt the room the way Greysmoke felt enclosed spaces, reading it for exits and pressures, and the specific quality of attention being paid. Greatjon Umber listened to Ned's summary and then said loudly, I want to see the beast, which was completely on brand and which broke the room's tension enough that several people laughed, including Jon. He's in the yard, Jon said. Greatjon looked at him. He was an enormous man, nearly 7 feet, with hands that looked like they'd been assembled from separate rocks and bolted together, and he looked at Jon the way big men sometimes looked at young ones, with a willingness to be impressed if the evidence supported it. You're the boy. Jon Stark, Jon said. He used the name deliberately, feeling it out in public for the first time, watching it land in the room. Greatjon's eyebrows moved. He looked at Ned. Ned looked back with a composed expression that confirmed without confirming. Great Jon looked at Jon again, and the evaluation happening behind the big man's eyes was more thorough than his manner suggested. "Stark," he said. "My father's name," Jon said. "My name." A silence in the room that had texture to it. Rickard Karstark said from across the table, "The king is here, with his queen and his household. This is not the moment to be making claims." "I'm not making claims," Jon said, looking at Karstark evenly. "I'm stating my name. Those are different things. The distinction will be lost on people who want to make trouble," Karstark said. He said it without hostility. It was an observation, a reasonable one. "Then those people will make trouble," Jon said, "and we'll deal with it, as the North has always dealt with things that want to make trouble." He held Karstark's gaze. "I'm not interested in the South's throne games. I'm interested in the North, in what's coming from the North." He looked around the room. "There are things in the Night's Watch reports that your ravens have been receiving for 2 years that none of you have spoken about publicly, because publicly looks like panic." He let that land. "I'm not panicking. I'm asking whether the North wants to be ready, and whether it wants someone who can actually help with ready, or whether it prefers to wait until the problem is standing at the gates." The room was very quiet. Great Jon Umber, who had been leaning back in his chair with the posture of a man enjoying himself, leaned forward. "What do you know about what's north of the wall, boy?" "I know what the Rangers say," Jon said. "I know what they're not saying because they don't want to put it in a raven and have it read by someone who will call them mad. And I know," he paused, "I know what Greysmoke knows, which is harder to quantify but isn't nothing." "The dragon talks?" Galbart Glover asked, the first thing he'd said since sitting down. "Not in words," Jon said. "He knows things, old things. The eggs were in the crypts for a reason. They were kept there, or they ended up there because something in the North understood that certain old things belong together." He looked at the assembled lords. "I'm not a Meister. I can't give you a treatise on it, but I'll tell you what I know." And he told them what the Rangers said, and what the Rangers weren't saying, and what Greysmoke communicated through the bond in those night hours when the dragon's ancient awareness surfaced, and moved through Jon's sleeping mind like a cold wind. He didn't dress it up. He said it clean, the way Lyanna Mormont said things, facts in order without decoration. When he finished, Great Jon Umber said, "The dead don't walk." "Tell that to the Night's Watch," Jon said. Another silence. "I've heard the reports," Ned said quietly. From his father that was a kind of testimony. Great Jon looked at Ned. Something passed between them, the Northmen communication, the kind that went back to shared winters and shared memory. Then Great Jon looked at Jon. "You're saying the dragon is more useful against what's coming than against a Southron king?" "Considerably," Jon said. Great Jon sat back. He stroked his beard. He looked at the ceiling, then at Jon, then at Ned. "The North remembers," he said finally, which meant several things in the one phrase. He stood, which was an event in itself given the scale of him. "I want to see the dragon." He looked at Jon. "And then we'll talk." Robert's procession left the following morning. Jon stood on the battlements again, watching it go. The long column, the banners, the slow southward movement of 300 people carrying all their needs and politics and plans back toward King's Landing. Tyrion rode near the back and looked up at the battlements as he passed and raised his wine cup, and Jon raised his hand, and that was a conversation. Robert himself had come to say goodbye that morning in the yard briefly, without ceremony. He'd looked at Greysmoke one more time and then at Jon and said, "Keep him in the North. Keep him out of the South's politics as long as you can." He'd paused. "And when you can't, send word first. Give me the chance to be on the right side before events decide for me." "I will," Jon said. Robert had nodded. He'd clapped Ned on the shoulder hard enough that Ned moved sideways, and then he'd mounted his horse and ridden without looking back, which was the most royal thing about him. Cersei had not said anything to Jon. She'd looked at him once on the morning of departure across the courtyard, and the look was everything the feast hall glances had been but distilled, clarified, stripped of the social performance, a look that said, "This is not finished. Not by a great deal." Jon had looked back and let her know without words that he'd received the message and was not afraid of the sender. She'd looked away first. He filed this without triumph. It was information, not victory. Catelyn Stark stood at the gates and watched the procession leave, and Jon stood at her side, which was deliberate on his part, and she was aware of it, which was also deliberate. They stood in silence for a while. "The thing you wrote," Jon said eventually, keeping his eyes on the column. "To the south." She was still for a moment. "Jon, I'm not raising it to punish you," he said. "I want you to know that I'm not." He felt her looking at him from the side, the measuring look. "I want you to know that I understand why, and that I'm choosing to leave it in the past." He paused. "Because what's coming, what's actually coming, not the political maneuvering, but the real thing, is going to require everyone in this castle to be pointed in the same direction." He finally looked at her. "I'd rather you were pointed the same way." Catelyn looked at him. In her face were several things: the long history of her position in this, the genuine fear, the intelligence, and underneath all of it, slowly, a reevaluation. Not a reversal. Something more honest than a reversal, the acknowledgement that the situation had moved past the framework she'd been using to understand it. "What is coming?" she said. "I don't know exactly," Jon said. "But I know it's cold and old, and it doesn't care about succession." She was quiet for a moment. Then, looking back at the procession, "Robb trusts you completely. I know. Arya would follow you off a cliff." "I know," Jon said, with the particular exasperation of a sibling. Another silence. The column moved south. "I cannot promise you," Catelyn said carefully, "that I'll become someone that everything changes. I am what I am, and what I feel is—" She stopped, composed it. "I can promise you that I will not act against you again. My children's safety is my purpose, and I am beginning to understand that your presence here is not the threat to it that I believed." She said it with the difficulty of a woman making a genuine concession, not a performed one. "That is what I can offer." Jon nodded. "It's enough," he said, and meant it, because it was, not everything, not warmth, not love, but a genuine shift in operational reality. And in the north, in the coming cold, operational reality was the thing that kept people alive. 3 weeks after the royal procession left, on a morning that felt like the year's first breath of true winter, Jon took Greysmoke out to the moor at dawn. Not for the extended flying sessions of the previous weeks, not with escorts or witnesses. Just the two of them, and Ghost ranging ahead through the snow in the long white silence of early morning, and the world going on forever in every direction. He sat on Greysmoke's back at the moor's center, in the flat, open heart of it, and let the bond go wide and deep the way he did sometimes, releasing the careful management of it, letting Greysmoke in past the daily guard, full contact, full presence. The dragon's awareness moved through him like cold water and warm fire simultaneously. The ancient attention, the slow, deep intelligence that was nothing like human intelligence, but was not less than it. The wordless understanding of things that predated language, the knowledge of sky and wind and the smell of the earth, and the deep molecular reality of being alive in a body that was perfectly suited to the world it inhabited. Jon let it settle. He breathed. He thought about everything that had happened since the hatching, the months of concealment, the revelation, the king's visit, the assassination attempt, the northern lords, the things his father had finally told him in the cold on the battlements. He thought about the name Aegon, stored carefully in the deep part of himself, and the name Jon Stark, worn publicly now like a new coat that fit better than the old one. He thought about what Ned had said. Your mother would have liked you. He thought about what was north of the wall and what it would require. He thought about Daenerys Targaryen, somewhere in Essos, with 3 dragons. A conversation for another year, another chapter of things becoming themselves. Greysmoke opened his wings. Not for flight, just opened them fully, spreading them wide in the morning cold, their span enormous against the gray sky, the scales dark and complex in the early light. He held them open and the wind moved through them, and the sound was a deep architectural resonance, like a cathedral deciding to breathe. Jon sat on his back with his hands on the rising ridges of the dragon's neck, feeling the warmth and the pulse and the enormous living certainty of the bond between them, and looked north, past the Wolfswood, past the Kingsroad, past the farmlands and the free folk territories and the deep ranging country, past the wall itself, that 700-foot monument to the understanding that something needed to be kept out, to whatever was moving in the dark beyond it. "We'll go there someday," Jon said. "When it's time." Greysmoke made a sound, not the coal sound. Something new, something that had arrived gradually over the past weeks as the dragon grew into himself. A deep, resonant note that was almost musical, a sound that had decision in it, commitment, the sound of something enormous aligning itself with a direction and intending to remain aligned. "Yes," the sound said in the only language available to it. "Yes, we will." "But not today," Jon said. The wings folded. Greysmoke turned his head north and Jon sat with him, and Ghost came back from his ranging and sat in the snow beside the dragon's forefoot, three of them looking north in the gray morning silence, the boy and the dragon and the wolf, while winter settled over the world and the north remembered its bones. Jon Stark, Aegon Targaryen, the bastard of Winterfell who had found a stone in the dark and held it until it breathed. He was 10 years old and he was not afraid of anything, and the world was very large, and there was, somewhere in the distance, a great deal of work to do. He was looking forward to it. Greysmoke lifted his head and breathed fire straight up into the gray morning sky, a column of orange-white going 50 feet up before scattering in the wind, and it was not a threat and not a warning and not a performance. It was simply an announcement. We are here. The way the old kings must have felt, Jon thought, when they stood at the top of the first keep and looked north and knew that whatever came, they would meet it. We are here, and this is ours, and we will hold it. The fire died. The sky was gray and cold and enormous. Greysmoke settled, warm and vast and permanent, and Jon breathed the northern air deep into his lungs and let it out slow. Somewhere behind them, miles south, Winterfell's towers rose against the clouds, and inside them people were waking up and starting fires and beginning their days, people who had a dragon in their yard and a boy on their battlements and a future that was going to be nothing like what anyone had planned. Jon smiled. He turned Greysmoke south, toward home.